I think all of us will agree that the sort of fallout from this war between the United States and Iran is certainly lopsided. Here in the United States, it's felt through, obviously, yes, the death of 18 American servicemen and women, which is obviously very tragic for this country. But also it's largely felt through the effects of higher gas prices, which is a major political issue. And of course, for people who are living below the poverty line, who are living below a certain income threshold, the price of gas affects your daily lives in multiple ways. But the effects in Iran, I mean, you're talking about death, destruction, injury, people having to bury family members. Obviously, there was that horrible attack on that elementary school in the early days of the war. I mean, obviously, there is a massive difference between how both countries are experiencing the effects of this war inside their countries. Just talk to us about how ordinary civilians in Iran are experiencing this.
Absolutely. So as you laid out, the war is waged over there, so it's not felt as closely here in the U.S., although yes, the death of, every death is tragic. The death of service members, and then also it's reflected in gas prices. In Iran, it's reflected in every aspect of daily life. First of all, security, from the viewpoint of a civilian, no matter where you live in the country, because areas across the country have been hit. You don't know if you're the next target, if your home is the next target or the next collateral next to a target, if your child's school is going to be the next target, the hospital, the university, the road that you're about to go on. So it's seen from the viewpoint of civilians, very, very arbitrary. And, 4,000 people have been killed. And so that's evidence and lots of destruction. And we're just seeing more images coming up because there was also an internet blackout in the country. So we haven't seen enough images in real time of the destruction in Iran. Now we're getting to see them. And then also inflation, of course, it's reflected in the Iranian economy across the board. It's not just gas prices like here in the US, it's the price of everything, everyday goods. Although the country is running, it's interesting how the government has been able to maintain some form of, public service has been ongoing, and there hasn't been, let's say, shortages of any basic goods reported, but still inflation and that increase in price is something that civilians talk about a lot. And then, of course, this idea of your safety and security, which is first and foremost when you hear the bombs, when you hear the jets flying, and when you don't know which city, which neighborhood is going to be next. It's very, very horrific. And of course, people who have lost loved ones are still grieving for them.
When all is said and done and this war is over, and of course we all hope it will be soon, what will be the consequence for the Iranian people? I think that there are some who fear that the Iranian regime would have learnt the wrong lesson and perhaps crack down on the Iranian people even more. I mean, obviously in this kind of environment, you're not going to see protests, and perhaps with the Iranian people, there is, political scientists refer to revolutionary fatigue, when you've tried and tried again so many times to perhaps, through protests or through political activism, to try to sort of steer things democratically in a different direction, and your efforts don't amount to much. Just explain to us whether there is that fear that the security forces in Iran will crack down even more on the Iranian people after this war is said and done than they did prior to this war.
Right. I mean, certainly right now, like I said, there's a securitized environment, very little room for dissent, for any form of overt political dissent. After the war is done, we don't know when that is because it keeps, stopping. But after it's done, I'm not sure, because this is also sort of a new chapter for the Islamic Republic. I hope they will learn some lessons from the war. But also the society, I don't think the grievances are going to go away. The political, economic, social grievances, none of those will disappear. Yes, now there's no room for public presentation of any form of dissent. But I think once this external foreign threat is removed, the idea of getting bombed any minute, then this will be more internal between the state and the society. And that gap has been really wide, and they will have to address it or close the gap. Economic grievances are very, very serious. People's livelihood has been the reason for many protests over the years. And that we also see that reflected in how Iran is trying to negotiate. So one of the main demands in their negotiations from the US is economic relief. They understand that there has to be economic relief They're looking for their frozen assets. They're looking for sanctions relief from the US because that problem is very, very severe. So we'll have to wait and see in long term if they can address any of these grievances or not, if this new chapter is going to have more openings. So after, for example, just one example, the Masa Amini protest, Women, Life, Freedom, this society, yes, there was repression, but the society, women, young people were able to push the state back one step and make some achievements because of the very high price that they paid in those protests. So now you, for example, look at public life in Iran, the dress code, mandatory hijab, the core of those protests, they have made some gains and they have been able to push the state back. But, it's very slow process. It's been coming at a very high cost. And what I want to reiterate is that this foreign, external, hard power military attack is not going to make things better. In fact, it may even make it worse in the long term.
As a new front opens in the war with Iran, the US is drawing closer to one of Iran's biggest regional rivals with the landmark nuclear deal. But a major new condition just announced by Donald Trump is threatening to torpedo the agreement already signed by Saudi Arabia. Now, there's a lot for us to cover this hour, but I do want to start in the Red Sea, where Iranian-backed Houthis say they hit 2 Saudi oil tankers, carrying out a threat to impose a blockade against Saudi shipment. Now, President Trump says up until now, Houthis have acted very professionally and smart during the Iran war. Those were his words. He's warning of major military punishment if these attacks continue. Mr. Trump also imposing a major condition today, as I was saying earlier, on the agreement to give Saudi Arabia technology for a civilian nuclear program. He says it will only happen if the kingdom signs the Abraham Accords, normalizing relations with Israel. The White House insists that was always the plan.
This is a condition that the president has spoken about many times with our Gulf and Arab allies. He wants to see these countries sign the Abraham Accord. It was one of the most historic accomplishments of his first term, and it continues to be a long-term goal of his to expand those accords to ultimately come to a place where the Middle East can be a peaceful and stable region. And yes, this deal with Saudi Arabia, the energy deal, is contingent on this condition as far as the president is concerned.
We'll go live to our Nick Robertson in Jerusalem in just a moment. But first, I do want to go to Kristen Holmes, who's at the White House. So, Kristen, I'm a bit confused, to be honest, because the nuclear agreement with the Saudis was signed last night. Now we've got this condition. And, the White House saying there, Caroline Leavitt saying that was always the plan. So why wasn't this announced when the signing, 24 hours ago?
Well, that's the big question. And it sounded like from Caroline Leavitt during this briefing that President Trump raised this morning for the first time, despite the fact that she's also said it was always going to be part of the plan. We asked her whether or not Saudi Arabia had agreed to sign the Abraham Accords. She said that President Trump had not talked to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia since he set this condition earlier this morning and would not give any more details than that. In the past, Saudi Arabia has said it would not normalize relations with Israel unless there was a clear pathway to Palestinian statehood, which Israel has said they will not do. So how this actually moves forward, that's a huge question here. But there is also this question of, well, what did they sign? And what is the meaning of them actually signing something if it's not going to go into effect? And how you kind of place a last-minute condition on something that, again, has already been signed. Now, there was a lot of negativity around this deal from senators that he talks to. There was also a lot of bad press around it, people calling for this deal not to happen. So perhaps President Trump was looking at some of that, talking to these senators, and wanted to come up with some kind of way to sweeten the pot for him, for the White House. But whatever the reason being, it's still very unclear how this deal can be, quote unquote, off for a contingency that was placed after both sides had signed this deal moving forward.
Yeah, look, we haven't heard from Saudi Arabia, but we did hear from Caroline Leavitt saying if Saudi Arabia doesn't sign it, the deal is off. So we'll have to see what Riyadh has to say on this. Let's turn, though, in the meantime, to Iran, because we are starting to see rhetoric really hardening, Kristen, on both sides, with Secretary Uber talking about an eye for an eye. This comes after days of threats, and now we have the Houthis escalating. What is the strategy? What is your sense of the messaging getting from the administration regarding the strategy going ahead, given what we have seen from the Houthis?
It is so deeply unclear what the strategy is of the administration. And that is even more amplified today after CNN has new reporting that the CIA and the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, have recently assessed that this kind of nightly strikes and the bombing that the United States is currently engaged in is not likely to move the Iranian negotiating position. So what exactly are they going to do? Because right now these two sides remain in a deadlock. And I hear this kind of optimism from members of the administration, from senior officials who say within the next 2 weeks things will settle down, but there's no clear reasoning as to how things will start to settle down. And a reminder is that there was this kind of ceasefire, 10-day ceasefire that was presented by mediators to the White House. Since then, the White House, President Trump has continued to order these strikes every night, obviously dismissing it. We were told by a U.S. official at the time that President Trump is still getting back or retaliating against Iran for both breaking the ceasefire and for the death of American troops. But at this point, it just is unclear where he goes from now. Now, he did a brief phone interview with another reporter where he said he's considering a massive military strike. Unclear if that meant troops on the ground or some kind of amplified military action than the kind of strikes that we're seeing every night right now. But he's been saying that for several weeks. So this isn't kind of a new statement. This idea that he has been weighing his options has been happening for quite some time.
Stay with us, Kristen. We've got our Nick Robertson with us, who's joining us from Jerusalem. So, Nick, Kristen and I were talking about this deal this nuclear agreement that we were hearing, and the United States saying now it won't happen unless normalization, of course, goes through on the Abraham Accords. From what I understand, and you know this story better than most, Saudi Arabia has previously said they would not recognize Israel without the establishment of a Palestinian state. So how realistic then is this condition? Because Caroline Levitt, the White House press secretary, said a few hours ago, if Saudi Arabia doesn't sign, the deal is off.
Look, to me, from all the conversations I've had with Saudi diplomats, the top tier and rungs down below over the past couple of years, the message, and I've kept pushing back on, well, can't you sort of do a normalization? Isn't that going to improve the situation? And you know, there's a peace in Gaza now, which has been a big part of the problem. How Israel responded to Hamas's brutal attacks on October the 7th. 1,200 Israelis killed, 250 Israelis taken hostage, and more than 70,000 Palestinians killed in the aftermath. The Saudis, the message I've got back every single time, and it's become stronger and clearer without equivocation, that unless Israel is willing to recognize a Palestinian state, a viable, sort of reversible pathway to a Palestinian state, then there's no moving forward on normalization. And the frank assessment in Saudi Arabia is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu isn't the Prime Minister of Israel that can deliver that, because they don't believe that he sincerely wants to have a Palestinian state, and they've listened to the times when he has uttered those words. So it does seem to me what the White House has introduced here, and look, let's face it, this was a pretty big about turn. It is a roadblock at the moment. There could be ways around it. Let's not preclude that. Don't expect the Saudis to go public with their anger and frustration. They're very good at keeping that in. But I would say just look at where we are tonight, just to bring in the Houthis, and they're hitting Saudi oil tankers in the Red Sea, and President Trump saying, if you do that again, I'll come in and hit you Houthis, and I'll hit you Iran because you're behind it. And the Saudis, from the sources I've been talking to, have been saying that if the Houthis were to do this sort of action, then the Saudis would have a military response against the Houthis. That could be a pretty big escalation. To do that, they're going to want to know that they have the United States at their back. If you're in Riyadh right now and you're trying to figure out what is your move against the Houthis and where is President Trump behind you on that. What is said today, can you count on it tomorrow? This is sort of just a microcosm, a small slice, if you will, of the uncertainty that's going on in this region at the moment.
Such great insight on the Houthi front, Nick. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it for us there in Jerusalem. Also to Kristen Holmes at the White House. Well, the EU is calling the Houthis' threats to impose a maritime blockade, as Nick was saying there in the Red Sea, a dangerous escalation, saying it could jeopardize regional stability. The Iran-backed militants are threatening to shut the Bab al-Mandab passage to vessels linked to Saudi Arabia. And that could put an even heavier strain on international shipping as hundreds of ships remain stranded in the Strait of Hormuz. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas is calling on Yemen's Houthis to cease all actions that could endanger international shipping. Let's get more on this. I'm joined now by Colin Clark, the Executive Director of the Sufan Centre. Colin, great to have you back on the show. Look, the last time you and I spoke, we were talking not many months ago, we were discussing the threat from the Houthis, and here we are again with the Houthis seemingly making good on their threat to target Saudi ships in the Red Sea. How significant is this, and what do you make of what you just heard? I'm hoping you heard what Nick was saying there of the Saudis and how they respond to this.
Thanks for having me, Issa. You're right, we've been having this conversation since the war kicked off back in late February. And a lot of speculation at the time was which of Iran's proxies would jump into the mix and come to Tehran's aid. The Houthis have largely sat this conflict out. And, you know, most, including myself, suspected that wasn't because of a lack of capability, but because the Iranians were holding them as an ace up their sleeve or keeping them around for a rainy day. I think what this conflict has proven so far is that Iran has a real knack for timing, and it understands this phased approach to the war, hence the timing of Houthi involvement when oil is going up and there's a lot of political pressure on Trump. This was well played by the Iranians. However, it could still escalate if the Saudis are now dragged in.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask my producer, Vicky, can you bring up that map again? Just want to show viewers where the Bab al-Mandab Strait is. Bidik is the choke point, right, at the southern end of the Red Sea. There we go. If we bring the banner down so people can see it, right, you can see it now. Look, it isn't as crucial, the Strait of Hormuz, but it still matters. I think 6.2 million barrels of oil have been traveling, I was looking at it today, through the Strait every day for the past month. So the question then becomes, Colin, how does the US react? What does President Trump do about this? Because on Tuesday, he was shrugging off the threat of the Houthis, saying, I think he said something, we'll just have to take care of business. How does he do this?
Look, the president's coming across as a one-trick pony because he's threatening overwhelming force. Well, if bombing the Houthis was effective, they would have been defeated by now. That's clearly not the case. Think about the favorable terrain in northwestern Yemen, very mountainous cave complexes. The Houthis are masters of the shoot and scoot, shooting drones and missiles and then getting back, into places where they're not as vulnerable. This is one of the world's leading terrorist and insurgent groups. And moreover, if you think about who's in charge now in Iran, right? The IRGC hardliners that are now running the country, they've spent the past 2 decades watching the United States fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. They understand the pressure points. They understand the leverage that asymmetric warfare brings. And frankly, I think they understand quite well domestic political constraints that the president's facing at the moment.
Yeah, let's broaden that conversation, if you don't mind, because and the strategy here from Iran, because Secretary Rubio said Iran is begging for a deal. I'm not sure whether you heard him say that. But meantime, we have seen Iran hitting Kuwait, hitting Jordan, Bahrain, bringing Houthis into the fold. What is the message from Iran, and what could they have next up their sleeve?
Well, I don't think the Iranians are begging for a deal. I think that's a smokescreen from the administration because they've been caught flat-footed. I think what's next for Iran, there's a number of different pressure points in addition to their proxies. Think about their mosaic defense. It's very layered. It's very decentralized. They've clearly retained the ability to launch missiles and drones at Gulf Arab states to disrupt the global economy and essentially hold it hostage. And we haven't even gotten into Iranian transnational terrorism capabilities. One of my concerns in March was the potential for sleeper cells, either in the United States or elsewhere in the West and Europe. That's something that we haven't seen yet. Is it because that capability doesn't exist? Or is it because that's just another tripwire that the Iranians are looking to use should things escalate further, i.e. a potential U.S. military ground invasion?
As more ships come under attack, this is what we know. First, the Strait of Hormuz, now the Red Sea. A second crucial Middle East waterway for oil tankers is now engulfed in the escalating war with Iran. Iranian-backed Houthis say they hit 2 Saudi oil tankers today, carrying out a threat to impose a blockade against Saudi shipping. Satellite imagery from NASA appears to show one of the ships on fire. US President Donald Trump says he'll hold Iran responsible if attacks continue, warning of major military punishment. The attack sent oil prices surging past $100 a barrel for the first time since May. Let's bring in Kevin Liptak at the White House. Kevin, this is a huge concern because there are 2 main routes for oil to get out of the Middle East, and they are now both under threat.
Right. It's another choke point in the global oil trade, and it is another front in the Iran war for a president who at this point has not articulated a particularly clear endgame about how he sees this all going. And so for him, I think this is just an added headache to what has become a fairly bleak picture in the Middle East. And his message this morning conveyed a certain level of disappointment at this Iran-backed rebel group, the Houthis, that are in Yemen, saying that until now they had, quote, acted very professionally and smart by not getting involved in the Iran war, and saying that he was, quote, very disappointed in them for now both firing on those tankers in the Red Sea, but also enacting this blockade of Saudi shipping in this very critical waterway. And so whether or not the president now becomes dragged in to an entirely different part of the Middle East remains to be seen, but he is suggesting that that is an outcome that he sees very likely and very possible if the Houthis continue down this route. Now, we were just hearing from the president. He was at an unrelated event over at the EPA, and he did touch on the war in Iran briefly, saying that in his view it was going, quote, very, very well, and that the Saudis did want to come back to the negotiating table, but that, quote, they were not ready yet in terms of what concessions they were prepared to offer. And, you know, when you talk to regional diplomats, they are fairly pessimistic that at this point the negotiations are going to resume. You know, they have been trying to get this de-escalation plan back on the table. They've proposed a 10-day ceasefire that would lower the temperatures, bring the 2 sides back to some sort of discussions, but they say that the prospects for that, at least for now, appear very, very bleak. And that does lead the question of where this is all heading. You know, when you talk to officials here at the White House, there are some concerns that this strategy of night-by-night strikes on Iran, we just had the 12th night Wednesday into Thursday, that does not appear to be working. That the Iranians have so far not moved off of any of their negotiating positions, and that is leading, I think, to some very difficult discussions in the White House about what exactly comes next. Now, in public, the president is previewing a major escalation. He's talked about going after Pickaxe Mountain, the highly fortified nuclear site that's buried under 400 feet of solid rock. He's talked about going after roads and bridges in Iran, some of that nuclear, or that civilian rather, infrastructure. But so far he has not executed on any of those threats. And I think there is some concern that we're just sort of locked in an impasse. And it is a deadly impasse given what the Iranians have shown they are still capable of in terms of firing on American troops that are arrayed across the Middle East. And so the president's still at a decision point here, but at least when it comes to the Houthis and this additional front of the war, ramping up the threats as well.
Kevin, at the White House, thank you so much for that. We're going to check on the oil prices right now because Brent crude, which is the global benchmark, is up close to 7% in just one day. $100 a barrel. WTI crude above $90 a barrel now. Anna, you've been watching this. I mean, it was skirting with $100. Now it's firmly above it, isn't it? It seems to be going up. And this is because there's no good outcome to these two oil routes being disrupted.
Yeah, we're now looking at essentially a double chokehold in terms of the two straits, and investors increasingly back to pricing in a prolonged oil crisis. The Strait of Hormuz obviously effectively closed at this point. There were 15 crossings yesterday. That's around a tenth of what we would have seen before the war in Iran. But now more interesting to watch is the Red Sea as well. Now, the reason the Red Sea is so relevant at this point is for Saudi Arabia. There have been security issues around this passage and with the Bab el-Mandeb Strait for many years, with Houthi militants, increasingly a sort of a risk around the area. We were talking years ago about ships taking the very long way around, for instance, with cargo, the Cape of Good Hope, having to make a very long transit, pushing up inflation, etc. The reason this renewed risk is so devastating now in terms of oil prices is because Saudi Arabia has been relying on this other route through the Red Sea to export the oil they couldn't get out the Strait of Hormuz. They have been piping around 70% of their crude oil exports across the entire country to reach the Red Sea so they could export it from that route. Now, with two vessels attacked, the question is how many ships will now be able to make that transit? Are we going to be looking at another effective closure? Prior to this, there were still 43 crossings, but we haven't got the data for today in terms of how many made that. But investors are very concerned at this point that this could be taking another 6-7% of global oil supplies just off the market. And for how long? The rhetoric in terms of the politics of all of this isn't improving at all. Interesting to note also, we are seeing a bit of a global bond sell-off today. Investors increasingly worrying about what this means for inflation, what this means for interest rates, and that will just increase the borrowing for governments, across the world. Thanks.
Yeah, Anna, thank you. President Trump putting new conditions on what previously was believed to be a signed and sealed civilian nuclear deal between the US and Saudi Arabia. The president now says the agreement is contingent on Riyadh joining the Abraham Accords, which would normalise its diplomatic ties with Israel. That demand is being applauded by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. President Trump also says there will be no enrichment of material and the deal pertains only to non-military use. Earlier, the White House spokesperson was asked why Saudi Arabia was offered a civilian nuclear deal by the US, but Iran wasn't.
This agreement is still being worked out. It will eventually, hopefully, be finalized with the condition that the president spoke about this morning. But this agreement in particular, as it's been discussed thus far, does give priority access for American companies in the Saudi nuclear energy program, which will ultimately benefit American industry workers and supply chains. So the deal that has been discussed thus far and will continue to be discussed absolutely puts America first, and that's obviously very important to this president.
Nick Robertson joins us now from Jerusalem. Nick, I just wanted to ask you about this deal with Saudi Arabia because it seems to have changed after it was signed, which is interesting. But it's a very difficult situation, this, isn't it? For Saudi Arabia to sign the Abraham Accords, it would want something in return, presumably, and it wants a two-state solution for the Palestinian area. And that's something that Israel wouldn't want, presumably. So it's very complex, and it's putting Saudi Arabia in a very difficult position, isn't it?
I think Saudi Arabia has sort of maybe woken up to one sort of a day and goes to bed with an entirely different view of the world, and one that's a bit more troubling, and that's for a number of reasons. I think just take a broad step back here. The deal, as it was outlined by the White House and had been inked apparently yesterday, was a worry for Israel because they felt that it potentially gave Saudi Arabia and potentially others in the region an incentive and a potential pathway to make their own nuclear weapons, and that they felt was unstable. Where we are today, President Trump has done something which makes it impossible for the Saudis to sign. This falls much more in line with what the Israeli government and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to see. So I think if you sort of look at it sort of geopolitically in that regard, I'll make an analogy here to the criticisms that Iran has leveled against the United States while trying to make a deal there, trying to get to the MOU. They said the US kept moving the goalposts, and they felt that the goalposts were being moved because Israel wanted the goalpost move to have a more favorable terms of the deal. Here we are again, where it's Saudi Arabia that's looking at a situation here where the goalposts appear to have moved, and the new position of the goalposts is more favorable, it appears, to Israel and what Israel wants than what Saudi Arabia wanted. Now, that's just one part of the picture. You've been talking about the Houthis attacking Saudi oil shipping in the Red Sea. Now, President Trump today said if the Houthis do it again, he will come out and hit the Houthis and hit Iran. That's a great message for the Saudis, who undoubtedly will feel that there is a military signal they want to send to the Houthis as well. But if you're in Riyadh, you've had these two conundrums delivered to you today. On the one hand, the president changing his message so he's not in your side, it appears. And the other one where the president is saying, I am on your side and I'll support you, you know, if things heat up even more with the Houthis. So if you're the Crown Prince in Riyadh tonight, you are probably wondering how much can you count on President Trump for that support against the Houthis? What's it going to look like? How long is it going to last? I don't think we're going to hear any public criticism coming from the Saudis about this, Max, but it amplifies and I think signals more broadly the concern across this region about how President Trump is handling this very, very complex, interlinking geopolitical jigsaw, where he is the one coming under maximum pressure at the moment because the price of oil is skyrocketing, and that's exactly what the Iranians want. So he's at the losing end of the equation as well as things stand tonight.
$100 a barrel. Energy markets are now pricing in renewed fighting in the Middle East after an oil tanker was apparently struck in the Red Sea. Brent over 100, and that's the first time since May. The West Texas benchmark is lower. Even so, the price of US crude returned to pre-crisis ceasefire levels. Yemen's Houthi rebels say they targeted 2 Saudi tankers. Satellite imagery appears to show one of them on fire. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, says the Houthis were, in his words, suckered by Iran into attacking a key shipping lane, and Tehran will pay for it.
I think I saw Arachi, their foreign minister, who the other day say or something about their policies, an eye for an eye. The president's policy is a head for an eye. I mean, honestly, that's what it's going to be. I mean, they will pay a very heavy price for the things they're doing. They're already paying a very heavy price.
Nick Robertson's in Jerusalem. Good evening to you, Nick. A slightly different question to begin with, which really is a head for an eye. But do the Houthis or the Iranians, their capacity of the US ratchets up retaliation, aiming to stop them attacking in the first place? Will it work?
Not in the short term. And eye for an eye, that's exactly what the Iranians did today. The US overnight last night struck an Iranian border post on the Iraqi border. 2 people were killed, big explosion. A few hours later, 30 miles away, the Iranians hit a Kuwaiti border post on the border with Iraq. That is an eye for an eye. It has a literal meaning here. It's not figurative. So when the Iranians say they're going to do something, they do it. When President Trump says he's going to do something, he's done it as well. And so both sides seem to be locked in to this cycle, and the Houthis seem to be joining that cycle at potentially very high cost as well.
Okay, so the Houthis join on the Red Sea side. That is a major development in terms of higher oil and energy prices. But how do we get out of this? Where is the method to get out of this?
I think the method to get out of this at the moment is escalation. That's the reality of what we're seeing on the ground. We're in a period of escalation. The Houthis are part of that. It's surprising that the Saudis haven't responded militarily yet to the Houthis. President Trump said he will if they do it again. And the reason I say escalation is the way out of it, because both sides are testing each other's will. President Trump and we heard it from Marco Rubio today, we're going to keep hitting them until they stop blowing up ships on the Strait of Hormuz. And now you can add in the Red Sea along with that as well. So, and the Iranians are saying, well, you hit us and we're going to hit you back. So really that's where we're at. No one is now seriously talking about how do we get out of this, the Iranians' ability to withstand this pain, and President Trump figuring out ways in which he could try to put more pain on them to bring them to the table quicker, which is clearly what he wants to do. From very simply, at an Iranian perspective, all they wanted to do was drive up the price of oil quickly, and haven't they just done that?
Joining us live now is retired Army Major General Spider Marks. Thank you so much for being with us. I just want to start on the somber news that we're getting today about the dignified transfer. You've got 4 American service members being killed effectively over the weekend. And by the way, what is technically supposed to be a ceasefire, right, between these two countries. When you have a situation whereby a ceasefire, or if you will, a memorandum of understanding, is not even worth the paper it's written on, it's not respected at all, how does that change the dynamics of a war?
Well, Zane, you know, a ceasefire truly is a messy agreement. Ceasefires, as a matter of routine, are violated to a certain degree, and when you create a ceasefire, there are boundaries around which you're not going to cross over. Generally, they aren't prescribed, but there are activities at the lower level where engagement takes place. There's an understanding that a mistake could be made and it could escalate. So routinely, these, at least the dynamic of a ceasefire, gives you some certainty, not necessarily comfort, but certainty that it won't expand beyond that. I think we're at the point now where we're what I would call danger close to an expansion or a complete elimination of the ceasefire based on what we've heard and what we've seen over the course of now 11 days of engaging in epic fury. But it has not risen to what I would call a phase 3 of epic fury, in that it's an all-out assault like we've seen over the course of the first many, many weeks of this operation.
But what you have now is somewhat of a new phase in this war, whereby both sides are willing to up the ante in terms of targeting civilian infrastructure, something that Donald Trump has talked about quite a few times. You have desalination plants being targeted by Iran. You've got bridges and that kind of civilian infrastructure being targeted by the US. Power plants, Donald Trump's talking about power plants as well. Just the fact that both sides are now willing to directly target places, areas, infrastructure that previously, I think a few months ago, we all would have said were perhaps off limits. You know, what does that tell you about the direction that this war is heading in? And also just the fact that, you know, there's been some talk that some of this could be considered a war crime. The fact that the US is now engaged in that level of attacks, things that would have been considered off limits, red lines, so to speak. What do you make of that with all of your military experience?
Yeah, there are really, I would say, 2 things at play here, Zane. Number one is deterrence, the definition of deterrence. Deterrence means your opponent feels that the risk is not going to be worth the reward, that the punishment is going to be greater than the punishment that they think they're going to impose on the enemy. And it also has to do not only with military, but also through all those elements of power, you know, diplomacy and economics, military, obviously, and the information sphere as well. So deterrence is at play, and we see that the deterrence risks are being elevated, what you've just described. The second thing that it's at play here is the law of armed conflict. That's the legal interpretation of those international bodies that describe what is legal and what's illegal in terms of warfare. Certainly the United States has historically, personal experience, we walk into operations with a clear understanding of being within the limits, the defined limits of the law of armed conflict. Certainly Iran does not do that. Let's be frank. So it is dangerous to talk about that, but your description of power and bridges, desalinization, certainly those are civilian targets, but also there are many targets within that body of the definition of target sets, that will impact directly on the IRGC and their ability to conduct operations. That's where the legal definition gets really, really tight, and you're going to get disagreements on both sides. So we can't be too quick to say we're going after a power plant, ergo that's a war crime. What we need to say is, let's define what it is we're trying to achieve. And if it includes that power plant, how does that affect the operation going forward and the dilution of a capability from the enemy in terms of the IRGC or whatever independent groups are working now on mission orders and not necessarily direct orders from the IRGC. So this is a very slippery slope, and 1,000 different lawyers will come up with 1,000 different answers.
Yeah, that's been one of the arguments of the Trump administration, that a lot of these so-called infrastructure targets are actually dual use, not just used by civilians, but also would, as you point out, actually possibly impact the IRGC and Iran's military as well. Just in terms of how Iran has managed to last this long, several months into this war, I think their resilience is perhaps surprising a lot of people. They do have one of the largest and most diverse missile and drone arsenals in the Middle East, built over many decades, a lot of it stored underground. Did the United States underestimate the sort of capabilities, the military capabilities, and the sort of sheer size of Iran's arsenal before entering into this war, do you think?
Zane, I don't mean to sound flippant, but wow, you think? Absolutely.
Yes.
You know, I would tell you with a degree of a level of certainty that our intelligence community, those that have watched Iran over the course of 47 plus years and going back certainly to the period of the Shah and how did that happen and how did the Ayatollah come from Paris and what were all those dynamics. You even take history further back and you realize this is an immensely resilient and proud people, immensely talented. And over the course of the past 50 years, this regime has developed a command and a control apparatus that is deeply, deeply embedded in the civilian population. And you've got the majority of the Persian people would probably say, we want these boys gone, but there's no mechanism by which to move them out of the way. So I would say that the intel community probably stated with certainty, look, we can kick this hornet's nest, but how long do we want to kick it? In other words, when are we going to decide that the threat that Iran poses, which is the nuclearization of its military and the delivery of a warhead by an ICBM, has been either eliminated or at least delayed? And the answer to that question is, look, we're never going to know unless we're there on the ground and we can open doors and we can see what's being done. It's never going to be eliminated. It's certainly not obliterated. We can delay it, but there has to be a protocol and an engagement profile that says, if we think you're going down this path, like what we think might be happening at Pickaxe, well, we may revisit that target. We might say, look, we told you can't do that. And we've had these initial discussions. We're going to do the best we can to make sure you don't get a nuke in that particular case. Okay, then we may have an engagement profile with Iran. Our diplomacy with Iran will be done through military force. That's a pretty hard thing to sustain and to achieve results. It's just punitive. So at some point you cross over to the definition of our engagement is just unnecessarily punitive. And we're going to have to have some way to engage with Iran that says, look, you are going to feel some significant pain. The regime is probably not going to go anywhere. We can't expect that to happen. The resilience is quite phenomenal, not surprising. So our engagement posture is going to be pugilistic. That's unfortunate, but it's the truth.
More strikes, more threats, and dwindling hopes of a diplomatic off-ramp between the United States and Iran. US President Donald Trump is warning on social media that the US will bomb or destroy one bridge or power plant, as you see there, every time Iran targets a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. Targeting civilian infrastructure can be a war crime under international law. In turn, a senior Iranian official warned that Tehran will consider striking infrastructure across the region. Iran's foreign ministry is accusing the US of using Pickaxe Mountain as an excuse to launch more attacks. President Trump on Tuesday threatened an American strike on the site, if you remember, pretty soon. Earlier, the president attended the dignified transfer of 4 US service members killed last weekend. A solemn moment there in Delaware. 3 died in Jordan, another in Iraq. Let's get the very latest from our Kevin Liptak, who is at the White House. And Kevin, let me start there, because this conflict, as we've heard in the last 24 hours, not only costing billions in dollars, and more importantly, as you saw from those images in Delaware, more importantly, lives. Today, as we saw, the dignified service of service members, an incredibly solemn moment. What more can you tell us about those young men and women whose lives were lost?
You're right. And they ranged in age from 19 to 30. They spanned the entire breadth of the United States, from Hawaii to New York, Texas to North Carolina. Their names were Tyler James Feehan, Isabella Gonzalez, Angel S. Rampersad, and Michael Emmanuel Swinton, and they died on the other side of the world. They died in Jordan and Iraq as a result of these Iranian strikes. And as the president stands there watching as their flag-draped caskets move from the cargo jet across the tarmac and into those vans, he's essentially watching the human consequences of his decisions go right in front of him. You know, there's no audio on the feed of this ritual. That is a standard that the military has set. But having covered these, I think the thing that you really do notice is the silence. There's no speeches, there's no music. It's just sort of the sound of the auxiliary engines from the plane and the footsteps of those carry teams putting these cases into the vans. But the reporters who were there today did say that that silence was pierced by cries of anguish from the families. They are positioned opposite the president on the tarmac. You can't see them as a reporter, but you can hear them, and they kind of puncture what is otherwise this very solemn silence. It really is kind of a searing moment for the president, and nothing, I think, weighs on his responsibilities as commander-in-chief more than watching this unfold. You know, there's something called the Dover test. It's something that presidents and military leaders have observed for decades and decades. And it's the question of whether going up to Dover and watching this proceed is worth the decisions that he's making. And also, are Americans with him on this as they too observe what the president is doing in their name? Now, before the president went up there, he suggested that it was meeting the Dover test, saying that polls showed that Americans did support the conflict. In fact, the polls show exact opposite. A Washington Post survey this week found that when Americans were asked whether the war was worth fighting, 68% said no. And so as the president weighs whether to escalate the conflict, whether to go after Pickaxe Mountain, whether to strike some of these targets that he's threatening in Tehran as a result of the Iranian strikes on commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, this is something that he will have to consider and something he will think about as he's talking about an escalation that could potentially provoke a retaliation from Iran that would put the thousands of American troops that are arrayed across the Middle East at further risks. Lisa.
And as you talk there, Kevin, of the human consequences of his decision, as we looked, of course, at these images, incredibly solemn images, you can only imagine the anguish from those families there in Delaware. Speak to the pressures on the president. You touched on that, but from within his own party here, not just so much from the Democrats, from the opposition. The polling, of course, very indicative of the mood in the country. But are we starting to see pressure points? Are we starting to see voices from the Republican Party casting doubt over the strategy or lack thereof of this war?
You are starting to see that. And in fact, it has been sort of present throughout this entire conflict. You know, President Trump ran as someone who promised not to become embroiled in foreign wars. He doesn't talk about that so much anymore. And you do hear some of his staunchest supporters questioning whether the president could have gotten the United States into the type of quagmire that he previously campaigned against. And you saw that on full display yesterday when you had Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, testifying about both the monetary costs of this conflict, which Congress is being asked to approve, but also some of the human costs as well. And what he sort of consistently said was that this was all going to be worth it if it meant that Iran would not be able to obtain a nuclear weapon. But I think it's clear at this point that the public is souring on the president's war. And when you look at the polling, it's interesting to compare it to the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, the types of wars and the exact wars, in fact, that the president previously decried. You know, the negative 40-point split that the president finds himself in is worse, in fact, than either the Iraq war or the Afghanistan war. It took, 12 years for the Afghanistan war to become as unpopular as the Iran war is now, and we're just almost 4 months into it. And so the president faces, I think, a very sour public attitude about what he's trying to do here. And as he tries to plot a course forward, that will have to factor in his decision making, particularly as more and more Republicans grow ever more fearful that this is just going to be the overriding topic for the midterm elections, not just the conflict itself, but also the economic consequences. And you are, I think, because of that, going to see more and more Republicans start to speak out a little more forcefully.
President Trump said this morning it's one of the hardest parts of his job, receiving the remains of fallen American troops. Right now, the president is at Dover Air Force Base for the dignified transfer of 4 U.S. soldiers killed over the weekend in Jordan and Iraq. He says Iran will, quote, pay a big price for their deaths. He met with their family members this morning. The 4 fallen soldiers are Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan, Private Isabella Gonzalez, Sergeant Angel Rampersad, and Staff Sergeant Michael Emmanuel Swinton. The president says Iran will again pay a big price for their deaths. The question is, what does that mean, and what is happening right now at Dover? I'm going to go straight to the White House. CNN's Betsy Klein is there. Betsy.
Dana, a very solemn moment as President Trump is paying his respects at this dignified transfer. This moment really underscoring the human toll of this increasingly unpopular war with Iran. The president now honoring these 4 fallen service members, marking 18 service members who have died since this conflict began back in February. The president honoring the service and sacrifice of 25-year-old First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan, 30-year-old Sergeant Michael Emmanuel Swinton, 28-year-old Sergeant Angel Rampersad, and 19-year-old Private Isabella Gonzalez. Now, the president is going to observe as the remains of these slain service members are moved in transfer cases from an aircraft to waiting vans, transfer vehicles there. This is the 3rd time in this conflict that the president has attended a dignified transfer, putting on that hat of consoler-in-chief as he meets with those families. A very human moment for this president. He said it is one of the hardest things that you do as president. Now, this comes at a particularly violent moment for this conflict, an 11th straight night of U.S. strikes on Iran as the president plots a path forward. The president warning that any time Iran strikes ships in the Strait of Hormuz, that critical oil thoroughfare, that the U.S. will bomb and destroy one bridge or power plant, warning that that could happen in the capital of Tehran. Now, of course, all of this comes as this war is deeply unpopular. Washington Post Ipsos polling out last week says that 68% of Americans say that this war with Iran is not worth fighting. The price of gas ticking up to over $4, $4.06 a gallon as of now, and all of this weighing on President Trump with less than 4 months to the midterm elections. Dana.
All right, some expert analysis in a moment, but first let's kick off our coverage with Nada Bashir joining me live from London. Nada, in terms of these counter assaults that we're hearing about, I mean, what kind of response is the U.S. being met with?
Well, we are seeing once again the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps targeting U.S. assets and allies in the region. We've heard from the Iranian regime, of course, saying that this counterattack is underway. And what we have seen in response is, according to officials in Kuwait, a suspected drone attack there. They say their air defenses are engaging hostile targets in their airspace. And this is something that we have seen over the last few days, we continue to see U.S. strikes on Iran. This counterattack focused on U.S. military assets in the Gulf region, including in Kuwait, in Jordan, in Bahrain, as well as other nations in the region, but also focusing on those allied nations as well. Of course, this does come, as you mentioned, following the 11th consecutive night of U.S. strikes on Iran. We've also heard from Iranian state media this morning saying that their air defenses in Tehran, the capital, were activated. It's unclear at this stage, according to state media reports, the extent of the damage sustained in the capital. But what we have been hearing from state media is reports of damage and strikes in parts of the southern parts of the country, as well as the western part of the country as well. And again, as we see these U.S. strikes continuing, we are hearing the rhetoric from the Iranian regime ramping up with regards to potential for escalation in terms of those counterattacks targeting allies in the region, but also, of course, the threat of perhaps an escalation more broadly across the region of this war, as you mentioned. But in terms of those U.S. strikes that we have seen overnight, according to the U.S. Central Command, this was once again focused on degrading Iran's military capabilities. We have had a statement outlining some of those targets, including operation centers, maritime capabilities, aircraft hangars, drone storage facilities, and military logistics infrastructure in Iran. The U.S. has maintained that its focus, of course, in addition to degrading Iran's military capability, is also degrading its ability to target commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. But of course, there are fears that we will continue to just see this escalate, that this has dashed any hopes for diplomacy. And of course, as you also mentioned, we are hearing those threats from the U.S. president that the Trump administration could target Iran's Pickaxe Mountain, in his words, soon. And this, of course, would be deemed a significant escalation by the Iranian regime. Israeli intelligence claims that this is a deep underground network which contains some of Iran's nuclear capabilities. The fear is that this rhetoric that we are hearing from the Trump administration could further dash any hopes for diplomacy, although we have heard from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, saying that he believes Iran is not serious about diplomacy. And of course, that has really rattled mediators who have been scrambling to try to bring some sort of close to this continued escalation that we've been seeing over recent days.
Yeah, will this conclude with diplomacy or further military approach? It is such a lingering question. Nada Bashir, thank you so much for laying all that out. Let's now bring in Danny Cernowicz. He served for 25 years in the Israel Defense Intelligence, including as head of the Iran branch in the Research and Analysis Division. He is now a senior fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies. Danny, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let me pick up on one of those notes that you just heard from my colleague Nada Bashir right now, and the possibility that Iran could launch further attacks on some of the regional allies there. I mean, what else could we see if Iran delivers on its promise of further expansion of this war? What could that look like?
Well, definitely the Iranians still have ability to increase their damage to especially the Gulf states. They can, of course, attack again and again, like they're doing today, but more extensively. And second, of course, aiming their civilian infrastructure. We're already seeing that in Kuwait and Bahrain. They can do that again very extensively. And also using what the Houthis are doing now, blocking Bab el-Mandeb Straits, and also using the Houthis to attack those Gulf states as well. So the thing is that they can have more targets, more countries, and diversification of military and civilian one. They also can cut off any communication line that goes through Hormuz Strait. So they definitely have the ability to increase more damage on the international economy and, of course, on the Gulf states. It's really depending on what the U.S. will do, but definitely the Iranians still have the ability to do so.
Actually, let's shift to the U.S. element of it all now that we've discussed Iran. I know that you've previously written that one of the first principles of strategy is that military operations should serve a clearly defined political objective. Danny, what do you assess to be the political objective of the Trump administration at this point?
Well, I think your guess is as good as mine. I think that we all know what Trump is trying to do. President Trump is trying to do in Central Command. in terms of operational activity, meaning they're trying to cut off Bandar Abbas area. They're trying to limit the Iranians' ability to attack tankers going on the Hormuz Straits, and thus undermining the Iranians' ability to actually control the Straits. That goes without saying. But the real question is what it serves, because it's not going to capitulate Iran. Iran is not going to forgo its control over the Straits. Iran is not going to forgo the memorandum of understanding. So I really asking myself, where is the end? Because at the end of the day, U.S. can create a lot of damage for Iran, goes without saying. U.S. has the military superiority, but at the end of the day, the question is what President Trump is trying to achieve, knowing that there won't going to be a regime change, knowing that if we attack the energy infrastructure in Iran, Iran will retaliate. And I think that this is the question that needs to be asked, because at the end of the day, this war continuing, but I don't understand for what end and what they're trying to do, knowing that Iran won't capitulate.
Hypothetically, do you think that the now week and a half segment of constant strikes, this tit-for-tat strikes, do you think that it may be enough to pressure the Iranians to return to the negotiating table?
Unfortunately, no. I'm not underestimating the damage. The damage is really severe, and every day, every attack to degrading the Iranian capabilities goes without saying. But we have to be frank to ourselves and saying whatever that we didn't achieve in 39 days of aggressive attacks, U.S. and Israel against Iran, we won't achieve right now in these attacks. Now, U.S. has a dilemma. They can increase the attacks, but the Iranians will increase the attacks back. Or they can return back to the negotiation table, but then they have to give compromises again to the Iranians. I think these attacks are important, but again, returning back to your previous important question, what is the end? What is the meaning of that? Because at the end of the day, the Iranians will still have the capacity to launch missiles against tankers going over the Straits, even if these attacks will continue for months. So I'm thinking that this is important, but at the end of the day, without a clear end to this whole campaign, then we're really asking ourselves what the U.S. will achieve, knowing also that the economical price for every one of us will increasing. Because at the end of the day, we see what's happening in Bab el-Mandeb Straits. We truly understand that the price of oil will increase. So you're paying a price for it. And the question is, for what mean you're paying the price that you're doing so? And unfortunately, I don't know, I don't understand right now how the administration think it will end. Because one thing is obvious, it won't end with the Iranian lifting or raising a white flag.
With the war in Iran and the threat of it expanding across the region. U.S. Central Command announcing that the military completed its 11th consecutive night of strikes against Iran. And Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps says that it responded with a counter-assault. President Donald Trump says that the U.S. will be hitting Iran's Pickaxe Mountain, a suspected underground nuclear site, he said, that's supposed to happen, quote, pretty soon. But Iran is warning that a U.S. attack on its nuclear facilities would expand the war across the region. The U.S. Secretary of State says that Iran is not serious about talks to end the war. But here's what President Trump had to say.
They want to desperately meet, and until they're ready to meet in a meaningful way, we have no interest.
We're not finished at all, but if we left right now, it would take them a long time, years to rebuild.
All right, let's go to CNN's Nada Bashir, who joins us live from Nada. So it's good to see you again, Nada. Tell us a little bit more about the scale of these counter strikes from Iran.
Well, this is exactly what we have been seeing over recent days, this continued barrage of drone and missile attacks attempting to target Gulf nations, allies of the United States, in areas where there are U.S. military assets on the ground. And of course, we've been hearing this threat now from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps of a potential expansion to an all-out regional war, and that really will stoke concern amongst those Gulf nations who have been calling for further efforts to mediate some sort of diplomatic resolution, particularly putting pressure on their allies in the United States to try to ramp up those diplomatic efforts as we continue to see Iran targeting this region. Most recently, of course, we've been hearing from officials in Kuwait who have said that their air defenses are engaging hostile activity in their airspace. We saw on Tuesday officials in Jordan saying that they had intercepted Iranian missiles attempting to target areas within their airspace as well. And this has been a repeated pattern now that we have seen over recent days as the US continues its strikes on Iran. And of course, we have been hearing from the Iranian regime saying that it will continue to retaliate. The US says it has now completed what it described as its 11th consecutive night of strikes on Iran. And we've been hearing reports from state media of damage sustained in parts of the country in the south and the west. And just this morning, state media reporting that there were air raid sirens going off in the capital, Tehran, although it's unclear at this stage what the extent of those attacks may have been and, of course, any potential damage there. But we do know, of course, from the US Central Command that the focus of these strikes, according to the Trump administration and the US military, has been on trying to downgrade Iran's military capability, focused on targeting military assets on the ground and infrastructure on the ground. They say in an attempt to limit and downgrade Iran's ability to target vessels traveling through the Strait of Hormuz to ensure that this is a safe shipping route. And of course, that is and has been the crucial stumbling block in any sort of mediation attempts to try to bring about a diplomatic resolution. But again, we are hearing, again, that ramping up of rhetoric, particularly from the US President Donald Trump, who has now threatened, as you mentioned, to target and attack Iran's Pickaxe Mountain, which is where, of course, according to Israeli intelligence, it's believed that Iran has an underground nuclear facility. This would mark a significant escalation. And again, Iran has threatened for an all-out regional escalation of this war if indeed such an attack would take place.
Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps says that they have launched a counter-assault to punish the United States. This comes after U.S. CENTCOM announced its forces completed an 11th consecutive night of strikes against the country. CNN's Kristen Holmes has more on President Trump's latest threat against Iran.
President Trump seems to remain fixated on this idea of striking Pickaxe Mountain in Iran. This is a suspected nuclear facility. Back in 2020, it was declared to the United Nations Atomic Energy Agency as a future facility that could make this nuclear fuel. And this is deep underground. It is a facility in which now we are hearing Israel has some intel that suggests Iran moves centrifuges as well as some of that highly enriched uranium deep underground into this facility. Here is what President Trump said about it, as well as what the Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said about whether or not the United States could actually reach that facility.
Do you believe that Iran has moved nuclear centrifuges into Pickaxe Mountain? And when you say we're not done yet, what is left to finish?
Well, I think that they may have. We don't have it on record. All we do is read the fake news. You know, we see the news is so wrong so many times. So, you know, maybe this one they have right, but it's okay. It doesn't mean anything unless they have the material. You're talking about the centrifuges. Yeah, it doesn't mean anything unless they have the material. They don't have. We follow the material. That's where the action is, and we'll be hitting that area probably pretty soon. And there's not a thing they can do about it.
Do we have the ability to destroy whatever is underneath Pickaxe Mountain?
Senator, a lot of our capabilities are classified, but if anybody in the world can reach anything on God's green earth, it's the United States military, the most powerful military in the world.
So seemingly playing coy there, the Secretary of Defense. We should note this is the first time in the last 10 days that we have not seen an announcement from U.S. Central Command that they are continuing these strikes on Iran. We should also point out that Iran has said that if the U.S. does, in fact, target Pickaxe Mountain, they would view this as an expansion of the regional war. This is coming at a time where President Trump, we know, is considering expanding that war. We've just sent over, the United States has just sent over more military aircrafts, including fighter jets, F-16s, F-35s, as well as those aerial refueling tankers. It is unclear right now still what the United States plan is moving ahead. Kristen Holmes, CNN, the White House.
Nada, it's been 11 consecutive nights of strikes against Iran, and CENTCOM says these sites and targets included military capabilities, but Iran is continuing to retaliate against the region. What's the latest there?
That's right. We have seen, as you mentioned, another night of strikes carried out across Iran, focused, according to state media, on parts of the southern and western parts of the country. We've also heard reports that earlier this morning, air raid sirens were sounding in the capital, Tehran, although there hasn't been any clear updates on the extent of the possible attacks on the capital or any potential damage caused there. But again, this is a continuation of days of attacks. And in response, we have seen yet again further counterattacks carried out by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, targeting U.S. assets and allies in the Gulf region, as has long been the threat from the Iranian regime with regards to U.S. attacks on Iran. What we've seen most recently is, according to Kuwaiti officials, their air defenses, they said, engaging hostile drone attacks. This, of course, is something that we have seen in Kuwait over recent days as well. The IRGC has also claimed itself that it targeted 2 U.S. bases in Jordan, although there has been no evidence of that to support the claim from the IRGC. But we have been hearing from Jordanian officials over recent days reporting that their air defenses have also identified hostile attacks from Iran. And this is likely to continue and potentially escalate if we take a listen to any of the officials within the Iranian regime, who have warned that if there is a further escalation by the Trump administration and the U.S. military, that this will expand into an all-out regional war, in the words of Iranian officials. And of course, what we have been hearing in terms of rhetoric, both from the Iranian regime and of course from the Trump administration, is worrying in terms of the prospect for potentially bringing back the negotiating table and mediation efforts. They appear to have really reached a stumbling block at this point, and we are continuing to see that military focus right now. The U.S. president has said and claimed that the U.S. could attack Iran's Pickaxe Mountain or Kolong Mountain. That is something, of course, that would be a significant escalation. According to Israeli intelligence, it is believed that there is an underground nuclear facility beneath this mountain. But again, this would mark a significant escalation. At this point, it sounds like a threat from the Trump administration. Whether we see any potential military action, of course, that would remain to be seen. But again, the Iranian regime has been very clear that this, if indeed was the case, again, would trigger a regional escalation.
Keep your mind on that map. We're going to want that again. With us now, CNN Global Affairs Analyst Kim Dozier and CNN Military Analyst Colonel Cedric Leighton. Kim, I want to start with you, and if we can put that map back up, because we are just getting word now that 4 vessels, and David mentioned a couple yesterday, I believe there are 4 more today, that turned around, that were headed out. The bottom of the screen there, Bab el-Mandeb, that is the strait between really Yemen and Africa there, where there has been oil passing the last couple months. 4 vessels turned around. So what does that tell you, Kim, now about these concerns of what the Houthis might do?
The Houthis sent a message directly to shipping companies. And first they said any Saudi shipping can't come through. And then they said any ships that dock at a Saudi port. You know, the last time the Houthis did this, though, they didn't just hit the ships that they said they might target. They accidentally hit some other ships as well. So if you're a shipping company with a multi-million-dollar cargo load, you're either going to take it through the Suez Canal, or if you were going to go through the Suez Canal from the outside, now you're going to go around the Horn of Africa. This adds costs. We're talking about something like 10 to 20% of global shipping going through the Suez Canal, which has to get through the Bab el-Mandeb. This is going to add up pretty fast if there isn't some resolution. And the Houthis have a couple reasons they're doing this. Part of it is, yes, they're doing this in cooperation with Iran to pressure the United States, but also the internationally recognized Yemeni government, backed by Saudi Arabia, targeted the Houthis' airport earlier this month. So there's a local reason and a larger reason that the Houthis are getting stuck into this fight.
So, Cedric, what are the range of options that I guess the U.S. we'd be talking about here has to open this up, although I'm not sure that the U.S. would be involved here directly, would they? Who knows?
Well, that's a great question, John. One of the key things to remember is that we were involved in opening up the Bab el-Mandeb and the entrance to the Red Sea just basically, over a year ago now. And so that shows that we have experience in the area, certainly, and let's look at capabilities. Who else could do this if something were to happen where the Houthis came in and shut off the Bab el-Mandeb. The answer is the Saudis can't do it. They don't have the capabilities, although they tried to fight the Houthis in the so-called Yemen civil war. That didn't work out for the Saudis. Then you also have other countries. They don't have all of the capabilities. We did it in tandem with Great Britain and other coalition partners, and that worked well, but we had to take the lead there. So now we're kind of spread thin because we've got the Persian Gulf to worry about and the Strait of Hormuz, and now we also, just across the peninsula, have the Bab el-Mandeb possibly being an area that would be cut off.
And if you listen to the president, the United States has to worry about this place called Pickaxe Mountain. And we can throw that up on the screen here so people can see what we're talking about here. Cedric, why is this a concern, and how would the U.S. go after it as the president has promised?
Well, this seems to be one of the preeminent areas for the Iranians to store some of their nuclear materials. So there's a report that the Iranians have their highly enriched uranium, some of it at least at Pickaxe Mountain. It's just outside of Natanz, which is another nuclear site. Interestingly enough, Pickaxe Mountain also may have centrifuges. So these are some of the ingredients that you would need to build a nuclear weapon. And Pickaxe Mountain is buried under a layer of granite and then some layers of concrete. And when you look at the tunneling there, it's about 145 meters, so let's say around almost 400 feet deep. And that, of course, is a significant challenge because if you don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, that might be the place that you have to go to.
Yeah.
But the difficulty is the weapons that we have may not really be able to finish the job, at least not directly. So it may require a lot of work in addition to bombing it from the air.
So Kim, as long as we're talking about nuclear capabilities, we're learning this morning from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and now we have some of our reporting. U.S. is entering into a deal with Saudi Arabia to create a nuclear program, a civilian nuclear energy program there, though that might eventually allow the Saudis to enrich their own uranium here. Why is that such a big deal?
Now, this is a deal that was discussed in the Biden administration. It's been in the works. It's something that Saudi Arabia has wanted for a long time. And when you look at the energy situation that Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries are facing, eventually the oil will run out and they need different capabilities. So on one hand, it's a way for the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to increase their business ties, especially at a time when, you know, the U.S. is asking a lot of Saudi Arabia in terms of being under fire from Iran, especially with this new pressure from the Houthis. On the other hand, it opens the gateway. A civilian nuclear program gives a country all of the capabilities it needs, so it's not a big leap to get to nuclear weapons. And that's going to be a concern for people who are worried about the whole area running away with, you know, arming with nuclear weapons because of the threat of Iran.
And we should note that apparently this deal does not include some of the safeguards or the levels of watchdogs that other deals and other programs have had in the past. But we'll have to wait and see more of the details there. Kim Dozier, retired Colonel Cedric Leighton, thanks so much.
Iran, U.S. Central Command announced the military completed its 11th consecutive night of strikes against Iran. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps says it responded with a counterassault. President Trump says that the U.S. will be hitting Iran's Pickaxe Mountain, an underground nuclear site, quote, pretty soon. But Iran is warning that a U.S. attack on its nuclear facilities would expand the war across the region. Meantime, the conflict has cost $37.5 billion so far, according to the U.S. Defense Secretary, although experts tell CNN the bill is likely much higher. Pete Hegseth and the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified before Congress seeking additional billions of dollars in funding for the war.
Do we have the ability to destroy whatever is underneath Pickaxe Mountain?
Senator, a lot of our capabilities are classified, but if anybody in the world can reach anything on God's green earth, it's the United States military, the most powerful military in the world. It's all about options and trade-offs.
Joining me now is Christopher Hill, former U.S. Ambassador and Assistant Secretary of State. He served as a U.S. Ambassador for 5 presidents, including Democrats and Republicans. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for being with us. Why the focus on Pickaxe right now? And do we have a sense of how effective these strikes have been?
Well, I think it's essentially going back to the roots of the thing. I think President Trump has realized that getting back to just a situation where Hormuz is open, it was open before the war, isn't really enough of a war game. So he's gone back to the issue of destroying their nuclear capability. Pete Hegseth, who does not do very well when he testifies or when he frankly opens his mouth, is now suggesting that we can destroy everything. And the real question is any of this true? And so I think there was not a lot of credibility for the administration early on in this, and I think there's even less right now. But essentially, the idea is to go back to the roots and go after Iran's nuclear program.
Well, to your point about Secretary Hegseth, while on the Hill today, Senator John Ossoff of Georgia used some of his past statements and asked him about them. Here's some of that.
Mr. Secretary, you stated we had, quote, achieved every single objective. Was that an accurate statement 4 months ago?
The main objective of this was to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. Their main sites were obliterated.
So just to review, you will not answer whether your statement made on the 14th day of the war that Iran's military had been, quote, destroyed and made combat ineffective was a truthful statement to the American people as you sit here and ask for tens of billions more for the conflict.
Senator's time has
Had a
expired.
historic and effective military campaign against the largest state sponsor of terrorism.
Won't answer the question.
What do you make of that exchange, and also sort of the broader question about war funding? At the end of the day, are the Trump administration going to get the money that they need?
Oh, I think usually administrations, when they go up and ask for money, which is essentially for our troops, are going to get the money. I think, because no one wants to be in a position of denying our troops what they need to do to defend themselves and to pursue their goals. But I think what we're seeing with Pete Hegseth is someone who simply doesn't have a lot of credibility, frankly, with anyone on the Hill right now. And I think he's used lines before. He's trying to use them again about, strongest military. We all know that. And I think at this point, there's just not a lot of credibility. So it's, frankly speaking, rather painful to watch.
Meanwhile, today, President Trump welcomed the Lebanese president at the White House. This is the first Lebanese leader to visit the White House since 2009. What does the fact that this meeting is even happening tell you?
Well, whenever you have a meeting like that, the staff will scurry around, gee, what can we give this guy? Because you want a deliverable. So I think that effort led to the idea of allowing commercial airliners to fly back to Beirut from the United States. But essentially, I think it's important to see the Lebanese. After all, a big part of the problem has been Hezbollah and the fact that the perception among the Lebanese, among the broader swath of population, as represented by the government there, is that they're being kind of neglected. They're not being dealt with. Their concerns are not being taken seriously. So I think it's a good idea to meet them. But it's kind of sad to see the deliverable coming down to something that I kind of doubt commercial airlines are going to be that interested in.
Chris Hill, staying up late for us in Rhode Island with insights from somebody who's been inside the room where it happens so often throughout his career. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Speaking of the war with Iran, a U.S. official tells CNN that President Trump is expected to attend a dignified transfer of service members killed in the war with Iran. 4 service members will be transferred to Dover Air Force Base on Wednesday. But only 2 have been announced. First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan and Private Isabella Gonzalez. They were killed in Iranian strikes on an airbase in Jordan. Sergeant Angel S. Rampersad is also believed to have been killed in that same attack. And Sergeant Michael Emmanuel Swinton was killed in Iraq during a controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone. Tonight, the top story is the threat of an expanding war with Iran. U.S. Central Command announced the military completed its 11th consecutive night of strikes against Iran, and Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps says it responded with a counterassault. President Trump says the U.S. will be hitting Iran's Pickaxe Mountain, a suspected underground nuclear site. He says we'll be hitting there pretty soon. But Iran is warning that a U.S. attack on its nuclear facilities would expand the war across the region. Meantime, the conflict has cost $37.5 billion so far, according to the U.S. Defense Secretary, although experts tell CNN that bill is likely much, much higher. CNN's Kristen Holmes has more from the White House.
President Trump seems to remain fixated on this idea of striking Pickaxe Mountain in Iran. This is a suspected nuclear facility. Back in 2020, it was declared to the United Nations Atomic Energy Agency as a future facility that could make this nuclear fuel. And this is deep underground. It is a facility in which now we are hearing Israel has some intel that suggests Iran moves centrifuges as well as some of that highly enriched uranium deep underground into this facility. Here is what President Trump said about it, as well as what the Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said about whether or not the United States could actually reach that facility.
Do you believe that Iran has moved nuclear centrifuges into Pickaxe Mountain? And when you say we're not done yet, what is left to finish?
Well, I think that they may have. We don't have it on record. All we do is read the fake news. You know, we see the news is so wrong so many times. So, you know, maybe this one they have right, but it's okay. It doesn't mean anything unless they have the material. You're talking about the centrifuges. Yeah, it doesn't mean anything unless they have the material. They don't have. We follow the material. That's where the action is, and we'll be hitting that area probably pretty soon. And there's not a thing they can do about it.
Do we have the ability to destroy whatever is underneath Pickaxe Mountain?
Senator, a lot of our capabilities are classified, but if anybody in the world can reach anything on God's green earth, it's the United States military, the most powerful military in the world.
So seemingly playing coy there, the Secretary of Defense. We should note this is the first time in the last 10 days that we have not seen an announcement from U.S. Central Command that they are continuing these strikes on Iran. We should also point out that Iran has said that if the U.S. does, in fact, target Pickaxe Mountain, they would view this as an expansion of the regional war. This is coming at a time where President Trump, we know, is considering expanding that war. The United States has just sent over more military aircrafts, including fighter jets, F-16s, F-35s, as well as those aerial refueling tankers. It is unclear right now still what the United States plan is moving ahead. Kristen Holmes, CNN.
And Iranian strikes on an airbase in Jordan. Sergeant Angel S. Rompersad is also believed to have been killed in that same attack. And Sergeant Michael Emmanuel Swinton was killed in Iraq during a controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone. President Trump seemingly tried to downplay the number of troops' deaths by tweeting this comparison to previous U.S. conflicts.
It comes as Trump appears fixated on striking Pickaxe Mountain, a suspected nuclear site.
Do you believe that Iran has moved nuclear centrifuges into Pickaxe Mountain?
Well, that's where the action is, and we'll be hitting that area probably pretty soon. And there's not a thing they can do about it. You know, normally I wouldn't say that. If I thought they could do something about it, I would never say that. But we'll be hitting that area pretty soon, and very heavily.
This sudden focus on Pickaxe Mountain, which is the English translation of the Persian word, raises serious questions. Trump says pickaxe is, quote, where the action is. Well, if that is the case, what happened to this repeated assertion after the U.S. attacked Iran's nuclear sites last year?
Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. It was obliterated like nobody's ever seen before.
And in June, we obliterated Iran's nuclear capacity.
Of course, that wasn't true. I mean, that was all after last summer, so that was before Trump even started the Iran war itself. But even as Trump in recent months has talked about how to get Iran's quote-unquote nuclear dust, its highly enriched uranium, he never mentioned Pickaxe Mountain until the past week. According to a source, Israeli intelligence believes Iran moved advanced centrifuges and part of its stockpile of highly enriched uranium to Pickaxe after the 12-day war last June. Okay, just think about the timeline here. If that is true, it raises a massive question. Because if Iran moved nuclear material to Pickaxe after last summer's bombing, why didn't the U.S. and Israel bomb it in the past nearly 5 months of this war? It does not make any sense. And Robert Kelly, a former chief nuclear inspector who will join me in a moment, says while the intelligence may be attention-grabbing, he believes there's not much to it. So we're going to have much more from him in just a moment. Because the sudden introduction of Pickaxe Mountain as some silver bullet solution coming out of nowhere to easily resolve what is a chaotic war with no clear end goal does raise a lot of questions. And when Trump was asked about the lack of a plan and a strategy, he snapped.
Mr. President, there are no signs that Iran is ready to stop fighting. So what is the plan? Is the plan to just keep bombing until they give up?
There are no signs. Why, do you know something that I don't know?
Well, they continue to attack our allies and kill Americans.
You don't know what the dialogue is behind the scenes, that they want to meet desperately to try and end it because they're getting decimated. You don't get that when you listen to your fake station, but you don't know anything.
His own base, though, is asking the same question. Just listen to what they're saying on Fox News.
He promised to keep us out of endless wars or unsatisfactory wars, and now he's in one, and it's not at all clear how it's going to end.
With the midterm elections a little more than 100 days away, the clock is ticking for President Trump to get out of this war before voters head to the polls.
Trump, so far, though, is not listening to that message.
Do you believe that Iran is trying to impact the midterm elections by threatening the Strait of Hormuz?
They won't have any impact on me.
Kristen Holmes is out front live outside the White House. And Kristen, this Israeli intelligence, right, that we're hearing, that the Israeli intelligence is saying that Iran moved a lot of nuclear material to this Pickaxe Mountain after the bombing last summer, that I guess it would have been done last fall. That's the intelligence that all this focus on Pickaxe Mountain right now appears to be based on. What are you learning about it? I mean, how much weight is Trump putting on this Israeli intelligence?
Well, look, it's clear there's at least some weight, given the fact that this fixation, this kind of focus on Pickaxe Mountain, which, as you noted, we hadn't heard anything about, came about at the same time that the intelligence came about. So this idea that Pickaxe Mountain, as you said, is some kind of silver bullet solution seems to all focus around this Israeli intelligence. And the other part to note here is that it's coming at a time in which we still don't understand what the United States plan is. They seem to be throwing as much as they can at the wall and seeing what sticks. Now, President Trump was asked specifically about this Israeli intelligence. He demurred, and he wasn't the only one who was playing coy when it came to Pickaxe Mountain. Pete Hegseth was asked about it as well. You have to remember, Aaron, there are a number of experts who don't believe the United States or anyone has the capabilities to actually hit these nuclear facilities because they're buried so deep underground. And Hegseth was asked specifically about that. He was coy as well, saying that a lot of this is classified, but then he added, if anyone in the world can reach anything, it's the United States. And all of this is happening. It's the first time Central Command hasn't announced a series of strikes in 10 nights. So we're watching very closely to see what happens in the next couple of hours, Aaron.
So, Robert Kelly, you're a former IAEA weapons inspector, so you know more than anybody about these sites and how Iran uses them and what inspectors found. When Trump is now just sort of out of nowhere talking about Pickaxe Mountain, which, as I said, is the English translation of the Farsi term for the mountain. This intelligence that's coming from Israel. We understand that Israeli intelligence says Iran moved advanced centrifuges and part of its highly enriched uranium stockpile to that site. Now, you know the details here, so I'll show everyone the latest satellite images we have of this particular site, Pickaxe. This is from late June. There's large trucks and vehicles near an entrance. But let me just ask you, when you look at this, you know the site. You know it's come up out of nowhere now. It wasn't bombed in this war so far, when presumably if Israeli intelligence is saying that they moved this stuff there last fall, they knew about it before this war started. So there's a lot of questions that don't have answers here. What do you think?
I think the first thing you need to look at is the Israeli intelligence is not intelligence. It's the third of leaks that have been put out for the last 2 weeks that are designed to confuse. So don't mix up this and calling it intelligence. It is something that's put forward to try to mislead us. Pickaxe has been known for years. If you look at Pickaxe, you'll see a lack of things that should be there. It's not connected to the previous enrichment site, which is only a few kilometers away. And it doesn't have the right indications, like it doesn't have enough electricity, it doesn't have a cooling system there, and it has these trucks going in and out, which you wouldn't have if you have a sensitive centrifuge plant in there. But if you want to really see where this comes from, we've been told now for weeks that the U.S. has satellite imagery that would tell us if the stockpile of enriched uranium was being moved. And that stockpile is a couple dozen small cylinders about the size of a fire extinguisher. So we know that they can't move this around because we've been told that. And now suddenly Israel tells us that thousands of centrifuges, which were much, much bigger and would require an awful lot of effort, thousands of centrifuges have been moved and we missed it. Come on, let's look at this and think these people are jerking us around, and we're not that stupid.
I mean, so Robert, why do you think, the way you lay this out, why do you think then Trump is entertaining this idea and embracing this as some sort of silver bullet idea?
Honestly, I think the first reason, he's fascinated by the name. He likes names. He likes to call things by names. If it was called Sugarloaf Mountain, it probably wouldn't be so much interest to them. It's a very, very deeply buried facility. You can see that there's a big tunnel going inside, which is not necessary for a centrifuge plant. It looks like a manufacturing operation that is not yet complete, and it doesn't look like an industrial facility that produces things chemically.
Kareem, what do you think the Iranian regime view is of this suddenly coming out now? The Israeli intelligence comes out about this out of nowhere, and suddenly Trump's talking about bombing Pickaxe Mountain. What is the impact of that to the Iranian regime?
I don't think it really impacts their conduct or their calculations in this war. Right now, the focus should be on restoring the Strait of Hormuz, preventing Iran's proxy, the Houthis, from blocking the Bab al-Mandeb, which is another key energy corridor. The focus should be on protecting U.S. bases in the region and protecting our allies. And going after Pickaxe Mountain is not addressing any of those challenges.
General Marks, Iran has been hitting U.S. bases. They are threatening to expand this war more broadly if something like Pickaxe is brought into the equation. We now know at least 18 Americans have been killed or missing that are soldiers in this war, troops in this war, 100 injured in the past 2 weeks. And I wanted to show everyone in that context, General, something Trump posted on social media today. He posted the dead in multiple wars. Afghanistan war, 20 years, 2,000 dead. And he goes on war by war, Iraq, Vietnam, Korean, Venezuela, and then he ends with Iran military conflict, 4 months, 18 dead. His entire point is, look at how this hasn't gone that long, and look at there haven't been that many people who died. Your reaction?
Yeah, it's quite frustrating to read that. Look, my heartfelt condolences go out to those families that lost their young men and women over the course of this engagement, as we've lost others in the past. And I've got very personal scar tissue with all of that. You don't measure success of any engagement based on the number of KIA. What the president did is inexcusable. There's no causality between what he is doing with this tweet and what we're trying to achieve, again, which remains somewhat of a mystery.
And what about the fact that he won't call it a war? He called the Venezuela situation a war, even though it was one day. He refused to call the Iran war a war.
Yeah, I can't respond to that, Aaron, and I know that's really more rhetorical than anything else. I don't get it. This is not what you want the President of the United States to do. You want him to embrace the effort that was put forward, convince the American people that this is the right thing to do, and describe it, and realize that we've got a coalition of partners that are going to help and continue to help and not diminish what they're trying to put forward. Let's pressure test what everybody brings to the table. That's what the commander-in-chief is supposed to do, and I'm seeing that. I have not seen that to date. That's the problem.
Just moments ago, CENTCOM announcing day 11 of U.S. airstrikes on Iran. And today, the country's top defense official was asked to explain how the military, he said, was, quote, destroyed and made combat ineffective just days into the fighting. That was more than 4 months ago, is still a deadly threat right now. Now, keeping them honest, whatever you might make of the senator's questions or the secretary's answers, if all of the administration's war aims had been achieved already, the war would be over. And it's not. The missile strike on Americans in Jordan made that tragically clear. And it seems the effort to disable Iran's nuclear program also goes on, at least according to the president. Listen to what he said today about the possibility of striking the suspected nuclear site inside Pickaxe Mountain.
We'll be hitting that area probably pretty soon, and there's not a thing they can do about it. Normally I wouldn't say that. If I thought they could do something about it, I would never say that. But we'll be hitting that area pretty soon, and very heavily.
Now, the president has threatened this before, and tonight Iran repeated its warning that a strike on that facility or any other nuclear site would be treated as a major expansion of the conflict. A war the president today suggested was nothing compared to other wars Americans have endured in our history. You can see this in the post right there, the president listing the death tolls, showing the far lower death toll in this war, which is certainly true. But it also comes on a day the Pentagon released the name of a third American killed over the weekend, Sergeant Michael Swinton, who was fatally wounded during the controlled detonation of an Iranian attack drone. Secretary Hegseth did not mention any of this weekend's casualties in his opening remarks. The Joint Chiefs Chairman, General Dan Kane, did at the outset of his remarks. Secretary Hegseth did, however, give testimony casting doubt on what we've heard from the president repeatedly, the suggestion that Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz and attacking its neighbors was somehow unforeseeable. When we left you last night, a tanker was burning off the coast of Oman, and shipping through the Gulf was down to a trickle. That remains so tonight. Let's go now to our senior White House correspondent, Kristen Holmes. Kristen, the president says he's going to attack Pickaxe Mountain. He says that will happen likely soon. Number one, he has said that before, so is it the urgency real this time, and is it clear what the plan is beyond that?
I mean, John, we hadn't even heard about Pickaxe Mountain until a week and a half ago, and now it seems to be the center of President Trump's fixation. Now, that is likely because of the intelligence that Israel has, that Iran had moved some of those centrifuges as well as some of the highly enriched uranium to that location, which is deep under the ground. But President Trump has now been saying that for a week and a half. We just saw an announcement from U.S. Central Command that they've begun their 11th night of strikes. Unclear if this would be a night that they might actually strike Pickaxe Mountain. The other thing to keep in mind is that there are a lot of experts out there who don't actually believe that there are capabilities to go that deep underground to hit that nuclear facility. And Pete Hegseth was asked specifically about this. He was incredibly coy. He said a lot of what the capabilities are for the U.S. are classified, but if anybody in the world can reach anything, it's the United States. All of this to say, it is unclear what the plan moving forward was. President Trump was asked that today during a meeting in the Oval Office. He got testy with a reporter saying, "Oh, do you know something that I don't know?" And the reporter really just laid out what we've seen. The idea that Iran has not stopped fighting. Now, the idea that after saying that there was a ceasefire, after saying that we were close, after saying that the United States had essentially demolished the entire military, they were still fighting. And the United States was still at war with Iran. And as you know better than anyone, this war is not something that these Republicans or President Trump want to be dealing with at this time. But yet still, it seems unclear what the plan is moving ahead.
And the Truth Social post we showed at the top, where the president lists the historical numbers of war fatalities. For him to do that would suggest he's sensitive or defensive about this to some degree. Obviously, there's been some polling out recently. 2/3 of Americans don't think this is a war worth fighting. What are the conversations inside the White House? Is it they think the president needs to explain this better? Are they sensitive to the politics? What is it?
They understand that this is a huge issue. It's not just the polling, it's also the American deaths. We are now seeing more Americans dying in the last weekend than we had seen since the beginning of this war. You're looking at 4 soldiers. President Trump will attend that dignified transfer. He is angry about the deaths, and this is something that he cannot seem to shake, to get away from. And you're right, we don't have any details yet exactly of what happened leading to at least some of these soldiers' death. And so in the conversations inside the White House, from my my conversations with these U.S. officials is how do we get out of this, or how do we at least press the pause button on this for long enough to be able to start messaging other things, to be able to focus on the economy, to be able to walk away from this war in Iran. And to be very clear, having 4 people die in a weekend, U.S. soldiers, the most, again, since the beginning of this war, is not getting the United States further away from this war in Iran. It's actually bringing them further in.
Kristen Holmes at the White House, thank you. And before I get to our next guest, I just want to ask the White House, the control room, if you could put that picture up again of the 4 service men and women who will come home tomorrow on quite a somber day. Whatever your views on this war, take time the next 24 hours to remember these heroes.
All right, now to new CNN reporting about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the U.S. war with Iran. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tell CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the war. The sources say Kane gave Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative consequences. A U.S. Defense Department source says military operations are currently on hold, but it's unclear if that Friday White House meeting prompted the U.S. to pause what had been nearly 2 weeks of strikes on Iran. CNN's Betsy Klein is joining us right now. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this meeting and the president's plans for the war going forward?
Frederica, President Trump spending part of his Friday with top advisors and cabinet officials discussing the possibility of escalating this war with Iran. But now we are seeing an apparent pause in that fighting after 13 consecutive nights of strikes. One U.S. official saying that military operations are on a hold as we are seeing these diplomatic discussions pick back up after that ceasefire fell apart just a few weeks ago. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz addressing that pause earlier today. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday White House meeting, we are learning, according to our sources, that Vice President J.D. Vance, along with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, both raised concerns about escalating this conflict. The president in the past has threatened massive attacks. That could include critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, Karg Island, which is a key oil hub, along with Pickaxe Mountain, which is believed to be a nuclear site. Now, that could constitute war crimes, potentially. And Kane, in that meeting, specifically raised concerns about U.S. munitions stockpiles. We've heard now from Pentagon spokesperson Sean Parnell. He says in a statement, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across combatant commands while ensuring the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." Now, sources say that other major concerns were raised to the president in that meeting. That includes the possibility of massive civilian casualties in Iran, as well as a potential refugee crisis, as well as this idea that this could spill into a broader regional conflict. But there are few people within President Trump's inner circle that believe that these options for escalation are going to yield the results that President Trump is hoping for. Frederica.
All right, Betsy Klein, keep us posted there from the White House. Thank you. All right, meantime, Iran says it held talks with Oman in Tehran about the Strait of Hormuz over the past 2 days. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated the blockade. At the same time, a new front in the war is opening in the Red Sea, where Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen have exchanged attacks with Saudi Arabia. That conflict threatening another critical oil corridor. CNN's Nick Robertson joins us right now. Nick, we've got this apparent U.S. pause on strikes in Iran. How might that impact peace talks overall?
It gives them an opportunity. We heard from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman today saying that there was progress, that the talks were constructive, that they'd continue at a political and technical level. But it's key to understanding the details, and we just don't have them. The talks were all about the Strait of Hormuz, of course, and the key point here is, do the Iranians finally agree that they give up control of the Strait of Hormuz and allow traffic to pass through, marine traffic, and not try to get any tolls and not tell them which passages and pathways to go down through the Strait of Hormuz? And there's no indication that's about to happen. So it will be the output of that meeting, what the Omanis pass on to the U.S. diplomats, what the White House gets back from those talks is going to determine the next moves. Clearly, the implication we've heard from Ambassador Waltz, from the Pentagon, from the indications from the White House, is this is a sort of unannounced temporary ceasefire type deal to make the space for diplomacy. But it's not clear just because you're talking that there's actually going to be an outcome that's good enough for the White House. I think on the Houthi front in the Red Sea and trying to stop the Saudi oil getting out to world markets, it's having a chilling effect. But as far as we know today, the Houthis haven't fired any additional missiles at Saudi infrastructure. So perhaps they're aligned with Iran, so perhaps they're taking a beat on all of this at the moment as well. And then, of course, tomorrow, Prime Minister Netanyahu will leave Israel. He'll head to the United States for the funeral of Lindsey Graham. But it also is meeting at the White House with President Trump on Tuesday. We can expect the Israeli Prime Minister to thank the president for announcing that Saudi Arabia has to normalize with Israel before it can have this civilian nuclear deal. But also the key thing there will be, what intelligence does Prime Minister Netanyahu share with President Trump about Iranian nuclear assets? Where are they? Of course, it was the Israelis that had a lot of information about leading towards the Pickaxe Mountain as being a storage facility for some of the highly enriched uranium and other nuclear storage sites that the Iranians have. So what else is Prime Minister Netanyahu going to put on President Trump's desk that then may influence where this war goes next?
All right, very complex. Nick Robertson, thank you so much. All right, let's continue this conversation. With us now is Ali Reza Nader. He is the president of the Nader Research Group. There is a pause in fighting right now, and Iran is talking with Omanis about the Strait of Hormuz. But I wonder, in your view, what kind of diplomacy talks continue? And with whom? I mean, we heard Mr. Waltz say that even the U.S. at the highest levels is still continuing to be part of the diplomacy talks. But I wonder, with this hold on U.S. military operations, what kind of impact these talks might have.
Thanks for having me. I think both sides really want this conflict to end. The Trump administration realizes that it is stuck in a quagmire, and the economy in Iran is suffering greatly. The regime is under huge pressure, and it wants to get the most out of its discussions with Washington, D.C. So I think the last few days of military action we've seen from the United States and from Iran is really meant to increase each side's leverage so they can get a better deal out of these upcoming negotiations. Oman has been a mediator between the two sides. It has very good relations with Iran, and will continue to play a big role, I think, in future negotiations.
And then you have stated that, U.S. attacks on civilian infrastructure inside Iran is actually strengthening the regime. Why do you believe that is the case? How do you know that is the case?
Look, before this war started in January, there were huge peaceful protests against the regime, really a revolutionary movement in Iran that was disrupted by this war. Right now, the U.S. is conducting lots of attacks against military facilities in Iran, but civilians are getting hit very hard as well. I'm very concerned about the U.S.-Israeli strategy of destroying Iran's critical water and energy infrastructure because Iran is on the brink of economic and environmental collapse. And the U.S. destroying these facilities is not going to hurt the regime. It's going to hurt ordinary people. Most of the regime's military assets and its senior leadership and Iran's political leadership is underground. They're pretty safe from these bombs, but the people above ground are getting hurt and killed.
How do you think specifically civilians in Iran are being impacted? Because obviously, pictures are not coming out, nor is the sentiment of a lot of Iranian civilians. So, can you paint a picture for us, of how life in general is being impacted there in Tehran and in the outskirts as well?
I think life in Iran is hell. Unless you're connected to the regime, life is hell because the people in Iran, and we hear this a lot from the reporting we're getting from within Iran. A lot of people expected that the Trump administration would come to their help after thousands of Iranians were massacred by the regime. That help really never came. The regime is still in power. It is executing innocent people left and right. And this war has demonstrated, I think, the weakness of US military power. And I hope really for once and all, American policymakers and the public realize that you can't overthrow the regime in Iran through war, through bombs from the air. The people of Iran have to create that change for themselves, and they can't do that while they're being bombed.
All right, we begin this hour with new developments in the U.S. war with Iran. Today, a U.S. source tells CNN that military operations with Iran are currently on a hold. And it comes as we are learning new details about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the war. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tells CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the war. The sources say Kane gave Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative consequences of ramping up the war. Since that meeting, the U.S. has paused nearly 2 weeks of strikes on Iran, but it's unclear if those warnings prompted the lull in the attacks. We've got a team of correspondents around the globe covering these developments. Nick Robertson is in Jerusalem, but let's begin with Betsy Klein at the White House. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this White House meeting?
That's right, Frederica. President Trump spending part of his Friday huddling with top advisors and cabinet officials to discuss the options for an escalation in this 5-month-long war with Iran. But for the last 2 nights, we have seen this apparent pause in fighting after 13 consecutive days of U.S. strikes on Iran. One U.S. source telling CNN that those attacks are on a hold as they give the diplomatic discussions some time to play out. We heard moments ago from U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, weighing in on that pause. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday meeting, we are learning that both Vice President J.D. Vance and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane raised concerns to the president about the possibility of that escalation. The president, for weeks, has been threatening massive attacks on Iran. That could impact critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, as well as the key oil hub of Karg Island. The president has been warned that that could constitute war crimes. Kane also specifically raised concerns about U.S. munitions stockpiles, but we heard from Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell addressing that. He says, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across combatant commands while ensuring the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." But sources say that other concerns were raised to Trump, including the possibility of massive civilian casualties across Iran, the idea of a potential refugee crisis crisis, as well as this conflict potentially spilling into a broader war across the Middle East. Now, there are few people, we are learning, within the president's inner circle who believe that the options he has been given for this escalation would yield the results that he is hoping for, Frederica, as he weighs that path forward.
All right, Betsy Klein at the White House, thanks so much. All right, let's go to Nick Robertson now. Nick, do we know how this apparent U.S. pause on strikes with Iran may be impacting peace talks?
It's certainly given them the space. So the Omanis had a delegation in Tehran on Friday. They stayed there through Saturday. They left late Saturday. They were talking about the Strait of Hormuz. We heard today from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman who said the talks were constructive, that progress was made, that they would continue at a technical and political level. So you can hear right there that the language kind of matches what we're getting from the White House. But the key details we're not getting right. And the key detail is, have the Iranians agreed not to try to charge tolls on the Strait of Hormuz, which is the main issue in play right now. Both countries have got their blockades ongoing at the moment, but the main hostilities are sort of abated. Perhaps President Trump will get more insights from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he leaves here tomorrow, heads to Washington for the funeral of Lindsey Graham, but he'll meet President Trump at the White House on Tuesday. Is very likely to give the president an update on the latest intelligence that the Israelis have. And of course, they've had intelligence that's pointed towards Pickaxe Mountain in Iran as a site where Iran may have tried to secure some of its highly enriched uranium and other centrifuges and other equipment that it uses to enrich uranium. So there may well be new information put in front of the president by the Israeli Prime Minister, who is keen, perhaps, let's not say for the war to continue, but the war pausing the way it has caused him political hardship at home. And he's got elections coming up in 3 months, so he'll be minded to try to find a way to persuade President Trump that there is still work to be done on Iran and perhaps present a roadmap for that. He'll also likely thank President Trump for putting a sort of a speed bump in the path over Saudi Arabia's civilian nuclear deal with the United States by saying that Saudi must normalize with Israel before that can go ahead. That's something the Israeli Prime Minister is grateful for. Big picture, did those talks give the product the president wants? That's the space we're in right now.
This morning, CNN has new reporting about a key meeting related to the U.S. war with Iran. A source and U.S. officials say that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned President Trump about potential consequences if he escalates the war. According to those sources, Kane expressed concerns about further depleting the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative effects. Now, it's unclear if that's why the U.S. decided to suspend nearly 2 weeks of attacks against Iran. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated that blockade. CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is with us now. Nick, it's all happening ahead of that meeting between President Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, their first since the start face-to-face in this war.
Yeah, and it's going to be an important one because Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been happy with the ceasefire that was put in place several months ago, and it's not clear where he stands on the current pause that's underway at the moment. He was speaking to the government this morning. He said that he'd be leaving for Washington tomorrow and that he would be meeting with President Trump on Tuesday, that all pending issues were going to be discussed, including Iran. So I think everyone here imagines that's pretty much going to be front and center. We've watched Omani diplomacy over the last couple of days. They took a trip, sent a delegation to Tehran. They got there Friday, left Saturday. The conversation was about the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, what the United States wants to see is Iran relinquish its desire and commitment to having some kind of payment method, some kind of continued control over ships coming and going from the Strait of Hormuz. It's not clear if the Omanis made any headway there, but it perhaps was this sort of pause has allowed that diplomacy to happen. So the question is, how will the president view the outcome of the conversations the Omanis had? But As you say, the United States continuing its blockade, the Iranians doing the same, saying that they've stopped 6 ships from going into the Strait of Hormuz, not by fire, but they're saying those ships have been now put at anchor. But the U.S. Central Command saying that they have told 12 ships and stopped 12 ships from passing through the Strait of Hormuz over the last few days during the current bout of conflict. So where it goes from here, this really does seem to be a matter of whether diplomacy has been able to take advantage of this pause.
Development in the war with Iran. Today, a U.S. source tells CNN military operations with Iran are currently on a hold. That pause comes as we are learning new details about a key White House meeting President Trump held on Friday focused on the war. A U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter tells CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned the president about potential consequences of escalating the conflict. The sources say Kane gave Trump his military options. But he also expressed concerns about further depletion of the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative implications of ramping up the war. CNN's Betsy Klein is joining us right now from the White House. Betsy, what more can you tell us about this meeting?
Right, Frederica, this could go down as one of the more consequential meetings of this 5-month-long conflict with Iran now. But President Trump huddling with top advisors and cabinet officials on Friday to discuss options for an escalation in this war with Iran. But after that meeting, 2 consecutive nights without strikes after 13 days of attacks. Now, one U.S. source says that military operations are on a hold as they give the diplomatic discussions some time to play out. We heard earlier today from U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, addressing that pause. Listen.
I've spoken with Secretary Hegseth. What the president is doing right now, as we've seen all along, is giving some talks some space. Talks are ongoing. They're happening at every level, from the more technical aspect of it all the way to the highest levels, of course, within both the Iranian government and the U.S. government.
Now, in that Friday meeting, 2 sources say that both Vice President J.D. Vance and U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane raised concerns about the possibility of an escalation. And we've heard President Trump telegraph the possibility of massive attacks for weeks now. That could be attacks on critical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, as well as that key oil hub of Karg Island. And doing so, some have warned, could constitute war crimes. But one of the other concerns that Kane raised during that meeting, according to one of the sources, was the U.S. munitions stockpile. We heard from Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell. He says in a statement, quote, "We have executed multiple successful operations across combatant commands while ensuring the U.S. military possesses a deep arsenal of capabilities to protect our people and our interests." Now, sources say that in that same meeting, other concerns were raised to the president, including the possibility of massive civilian casualties in Iran, the concerns about a refugee crisis potentially, as well as this conflict spilling into a broader regional conflict. Now, there are few people at this point in the president's inner circle that believe that the escalation options the president has been presented are going to yield the results that he is hoping for. So he's plotting a path forward with all this information. We'll wait to see what happens tonight, Frederica.
Israeli forces used tear gas and arrested dozens of Palestinians. This was in the occupied West Bank on Saturday. This is video from the village of Tel, where just a day earlier, clashes left 4 Palestinians and 2 Israeli soldiers dead. On the orders of the prime minister, the Israeli military began preparing for a large-scale operation, canceling leave and getting ready to send in reinforcements. A paramedic described how people in the village are feeling.
People here are scared of what happened yesterday, noting that around 8 houses were set on fire in the village, and vehicles as well. So people started taking precautions and buying fire extinguishers and first aid kits to be able to tend to the incidents until the needed services and paramedics arrive.
But some Israelis are coming together to condemn settler assaults on Palestinians in the West Bank. Here's a look at Tel Aviv on Saturday, filled with people chanting and carrying eye-catching signs. The deadly incident Friday in the West Bank came amid a marked escalation in settler attacks in the territory. The UN has called for urgent action to stop the violence. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to visit the U.S. this week. He's going to meet with President Trump at the White House on Tuesday. While he's in the U.S., Mr. Netanyahu is also expected to attend the funeral for the late Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. This is the Prime Minister's 7th visit to the U.S. to meet with the president and comes, of course, at President Trump's invitation. Joining me now from Jerusalem is Yaakov Katz. He is the co-founder of the Middle East America Dialogue, an author and a senior columnist at the Jerusalem Post. Thank you so much for joining us, first of all, Yaakov. I want to talk, of course, about this visit that will take place on Tuesday. And we know Iran's going to be at the top of the agenda. We know as well that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been opposed to negotiations. So let's get into the details here. What plans, ideas, alternatives is he going to pitch to President Trump on the Tehran front? How is he going to try to shape Washington's next move here?
Well, I think that in Israel, there's a feeling of, Salma, of like a bad taste, the way that the war has been going and the way it ended with that MOU in the middle of June that didn't really pan out because, as we've seen, except for the last 2 days, almost 2 weeks of every single day airstrikes by the Americans against Iran, which is refusing to capitulate and basically give in to what Trump's basic demands have been, to give up the nuclear program, to open the Strait of Hormuz, and to stop the continued buildup of their military capabilities. Israel would like to see more strikes, more extensive, to include more targets. And I think that that's what Netanyahu was coming to Washington, is to discuss with Trump, okay, what are these next steps going to be? How do we make sure that a bad deal is potentially not reached? But at the same time, Salma, we have to keep in mind, Netanyahu is very sensitive and aware of the fact that there is a growing voice or sounds within Washington, especially within the Republican Party, that it was him and it was Israel that dragged the United States and Donald Trump specifically into this war. He doesn't want to be seen as doing that again. So he's going to have to balance both of these interests very carefully. On the one hand, try to get out of Trump what he can on Iran. On the other hand, not be seen as, again, the guy who's the warmonger who's dragging America into what has already been called a forever war.
So let's delve into that further, because this is the crux of the issue here, right? Is this up and down relationship between Netanyahu and Trump over the last few months? Give me a current state of play, if you will, of their relationship. Does he really have President Trump's ear at this moment, or is he going to be unheard, as you said, because of these criticisms in Washington?
Well, I mean, that's a real good question, because what we've looked and we've seen over the last few weeks is that there is a strain in the relationship. It's no secret. I mean, just listen to Vice President J.D. Vance's comments in that podcast interview with Joe Rogan, things that he said about a campaign, this alleged campaign that the Israeli government has launched in America against him specifically and on the administration to pressure them to continue the war. We've seen how President Trump has met with President Erdogan of Turkey, a known critic, and very hostile relations between Netanyahu and Erdogan. He's met with the Iraqi prime minister. He's met with the Lebanese president. Netanyahu has been trying to get a meeting with Trump for several weeks and hasn't succeeded. Now he's been able to connect that with the funeral of the late Senator Lindsey Graham that's supposed to also take place on Tuesday. So he's able to combine between the two. But Israel has been, and you can see this, it's quite apparent, has been pushed aside from the point in the beginning few weeks of the war. Joint planning, joint deliberations, joint strategy. Now it's as if Israel's not even in the room. So Netanyahu wants to try to get back in that room, not only, but also back at a chair at the table in making those decisions. Will Trump give him that? I mean, it will depend on what mood the president's in, on what the atmosphere is like, and basically also what Israel's bringing on its own and what it can bring as an advantage to the next steps on Iran.
So let's talk about that, because like you said, Netanyahu wants to be back in that room. These men, both Netanyahu and Trump, are all about the art of the deal. What concessions or sweeteners maybe be offered? Because we know that President Trump is losing patience on Gaza. He's losing patience on Lebanon. He's losing patience on Iran. Is there a deal here that Prime Minister Netanyahu could offer, or a concession to ease that?
Well, I mean, he's also probably, I'm guessing that President Trump is also watching what's happening in the West Bank, as you reported just a few minutes ago, and seeing also how there's increasing violence there. And he's not going to be happy with that situation either. So there's a lot of multiple fronts that Israel continues to find itself in without really a resolution on any of them. I mean, in Lebanon, it's probably the most optimistic. We have this pilot program that the Israeli Defense Forces are moving out of southern Lebanese villages, and the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, is moving in and to fill the void and hopefully prevent Hezbollah from returning. But you're right, Gaza's stuck. West Bank, there's no political horizon. And Iran, it doesn't seem like anything's moving forward. I think that what Trump might want out of Netanyahu, unless they're about to go again towards a joint offensive against the Iranians, is sit tight, let me reach a political resolution, and don't ruin it for me. There were those voices that we heard in the immediate aftermath of the MOU in June, that because of the continued violence between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, which I think was completely legitimate on Israel's part, it has to defend itself, but still perception was that whenever Israel defended itself in the north and attacked in Lebanon, the Iranians used that as an excuse not to agree to an agreement with the Americans. So Trump might want Netanyahu, he'll say, Bibi, just sit tight, let me get this agreement, don't get in the way. Can Netanyahu be seen as doing that with the elections on the horizon? Let's remember, Salma, Israel has its own elections, October 27th. Netanyahu needs to be seen as standing firm, standing tough, standing up to whatever some other foreign leader tells him to do. He can't give in that easily.
This morning on the U.S. war in Iran. It involves a key meeting that President Trump had on Friday. Now, a source and U.S. official tell CNN that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane came to warn President Trump at a meeting about escalating the war. The sources say that Kane told Trump his military options, but he also expressed concerns about further depleting the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative consequences. Now, it's unclear if those reasons prompted the U.S. to pause what had been nearly 2 consecutive weeks of strikes on Iran. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade, though, of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated that blockade. Let's go now to CNN International diplomatic editor Nick Robertson. What is the Trump administration saying about the concerns of escalation ahead of this meeting with Netanyahu on Tuesday?
Yeah, the concern is, this is something that analysts CNN have spoken to as well, have said the defensive missile systems like the THAAD, the Patriot, a lot of them were used up defending against all those incoming Iranian missiles in the earlier part of the war a few months ago. So that's a concern. A significant number of Tomahawks also, an attack, land attack weapon, also used up. So if you commit more weapon systems to another round of fighting, then you reduce your options for another war or another conflict in another theater around the world. That was, as from what we understand, was the concern raised. What it has allowed, this pause, whatever the reason, and diplomats I'm talking to are sort of referring to this as an unannounced ceasefire, if you will, that's now gone through 2 nights. It's given an opportunity for an Omani delegation to go to Tehran. They went Friday, stayed into Saturday, left late Saturday to have conversations. The Iranian foreign minister saying that there was progress in those talks, that they focused on the Strait of Hormuz, but there's absolutely no indication here whatsoever that the Iranians have given ground on their core point on the Strait of Hormuz, which is they want to have control over it and be able to make money out of it in the future. The Iranians also have spoken about how they've caused a number of vessels, 6 vessels, to go to anchor and not transit the Strait of Hormuz. I think when you step back just a tiny little bit and look at the messaging from both the U.S. side and the Iranian side, both operating their blockades, but not signaling it through maximalist shooting of ships, but sort of a one tempo down, if you will, the boarding and inspection and the ships being put at anchor. Can this pause for diplomacy hold? And as discussed here, the cost of an escalation, there are implications with that. And that was what was explained to the president.
A new round of tariffs just kicked in on almost every single U.S. import. Here's why. The U.S. claims that 60 of its trading partners are using forced labor to produce goods exported to the U.S. These tariffs hit Friday just after another similar tariff expired. So while it won't hit your wallet too much, rising gas prices will. We'll talk about that, of course. All the factors that have prevented oil from surging recently are either weaker or gone. I'm joined now by Washington correspondent for Yahoo Finance, Ben Worskell. Ben, welcome back to the show. Let's start with the tariffs. The tariffs have been unpopular here across the U.S. since so-called Liberation Day. While these tariffs are not nearly as high as the ones implemented that were shut down by the Supreme Court, you've got reporting about the impact and how much it's really going to affect the imports coming in from around the world.
Yeah, good to be with you. These tariffs are, as you mentioned, these tariffs are kind of a changeover of sorts to new tariff authorities that aren't going to have a lot of impacts immediately. But there is a lot of evidence here that what Trump is trying to do is set up more tariffs down the road as he goes forward. The main headline this week was a switch up of tariffs from 10% tariffs that expired on Friday at midnight to new tariffs of 10 to 12.5% that came into effect at 12:01. So just 1 minute later on this issue of forced labor you mentioned here. This doesn't change the tariff rate, but it does create a more legally durable option that the White House thinks they can build on. We're expecting more investigations there in the months ahead that could raise these rates, even as they don't change now. Another important strand on tariffs to watch this week is Trump's announcement on Canada. He talked about 50% tariffs on Canada that could be in effect by August on some goods. This again has sort of limited immediate effects. It's only impacts about 5% of U.S. imports, but this is a new tariff authority that we haven't seen from Trump before. He's reaching all the way back to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 for this. This is a much more legal, much more quick acting option that has a lot of legal problems. The question whether this stands up in court is a big one, but the sense I get from listening to the administration and talking to trade officials is that they're trying to see if this will stick, if this will stand up in court, and if Trump can do this, we could see a lot more from that in the months ahead. But the bottom line, as you mentioned, tariff rates began this week at about 11%. They're still at 11%. They're just trying to push it up higher to these kind of pre-liberation or these Liberation Day rates.
We'll see if there's any retaliation. Of course, we saw that, in 2025 from Canada, China, other countries as well. Let's talk about oil prices above $100 a barrel on Thursday for the first time since May. This morning, as we've reported, $4.11 per gallon for regular nationally on average. When you add in the Houthis' attacks on vessels passing through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, in addition to what's happening at the Strait of Hormuz, how does that change the prospect for the next several weeks or months of this war and the price of oil?
Absolutely. No, it really creates a real level of uncertainty in the energy sector that is really notable. A third factor I'll add for you is the war in Ukraine. That is a underappreciated aspect of this with Russian refineries being bombarded here. So this is essentially a perfect storm for the energy sector and has seen crude oil prices up 20% over the last month. And as you mentioned, prices at the pump, $4.11. One important, I think, conversation amongst the sector is how things aren't worse on this. $4.11 price, I don't want to downplay $4.11 a gallon gas. That's lower than it was earlier in the war, and it's lower than it was $5 a gallon gas just a few years back. This comes as the energy sector has talked about how things could get worse in a hurry here if inventory levels continue to drop as they're going forward. But there's also been predictions since February, since this war in Iran began, of much more dire consequences here than what we're seeing at the moment. Again, $100 a gallon for crude oil and $4.11 gas is significant, but there's a lot of folks out there that are thinking the inventory levels and things like demand could pick up in the weeks ahead and push things even worse. bottom line here for oil markets is no one really knows what's going to happen, and we've had predictions for months now that have been mixed on this front, but we are seeing pressure on a lot of different fronts from around the globe.
Speaking of predictions, and I got 30 seconds for you here, Ben, we got a Fed meeting coming up midweek. What's the expectation on rates?
Yeah, all eyes will be on the Federal Reserve. The expectation is that rates will be steady, but we're going to have a real conversation at the Fed about all these different factors. Oil prices are a major one. The new chairman, Kevin Warsh, has sort of taken the Fed out of the business of offering forward guidance here, but they are expecting to keep rates steady. The question is when they have to step in on rates. For right now, lower inflation readings for June means the Fed probably holds steady, but they're likely to raise this fall is what the expectation is.
This morning, CNN has new reporting about a key meeting related to the U.S. war with Iran. A source and U.S. officials say that Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane warned President Trump about potential consequences if he escalates the war. According to those sources, Kane expressed concerns about further depleting the U.S. munitions stockpile and other possible negative effects. Now, it's unclear if that's why the U.S. decided to suspend nearly 2 weeks of attacks against Iran. The U.S. military has continued its naval blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command posted on social media yesterday that it boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea that violated that blockade. CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is with us now. Nick, it's all happening ahead of that meeting between President Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, their first since the start face-to-face in this war.
Yeah, and it's going to be an important one because Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been happy with the ceasefire that was put in place several months ago, and it's not clear where he stands on the current pause that's underway at the moment. He was speaking to the government this morning. He said that he'd be leaving for Washington tomorrow and that he would be meeting with President Trump on Tuesday, that all pending issues were going to be discussed, including Iran. So I think everyone here imagines that's pretty much going to be front and center. We've watched Omani diplomacy over the last couple of days. They took a trip, sent a delegation to Tehran. They got there Friday, left Saturday. The conversation was about the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, what the United States wants to see is Iran relinquish its desire and commitment to having some kind of payment method, some kind of continued control over ships coming and going from the Strait of Hormuz. It's not clear if the Omanis made any headway there, but it perhaps was this sort of pause has allowed that diplomacy to happen. So the question is, how will the president view the outcome of the conversations the Omanis had? But as you say, the United States continuing its blockade, the Iranians doing the same, saying that they've stopped 6 ships from going into the Strait of Hormuz, not by fire, but they're saying those ships have been now put at anchor. But the U.S. Central Command saying that they have told 12 ships and stopped 12 ships from passing through the Strait of Hormuz over the last few days during the current bout of conflict. So where it goes from here, this really does seem to be a matter of whether diplomacy has been able to take advantage of this pause.
Concerns of the Iran war widening with a new front emerging in the Red Sea. Video showing smoke rising near an oil facility in Saudi Arabia, which the Houthis claim to have hit on Saturday. The Iranian-backed rebel group in Yemen says it carried out 2 military operations using dozens of missiles and drones. And it comes a day after Saudi Arabia launched strikes in retaliation for Houthi attacks on commercial ships.
We reaffirm that the maritime blockade imposed on the Saudi enemy remains in force in response to its aggression and unjust blockade, which has continued for 12 years. We will not hesitate to expand our military movements and escalate our actions in the coming hours and days, in line with our policy of blockade for blockade and escalation for escalation.
The U.S. military is enforcing its blockade of Iranian ports. It says U.S. forces boarded a tanker on the Arabian Sea Saturday to verify it was in compliance before allowing it to continue its journey. Since reimposing the blockade earlier this month, the U.S. military has redirected 12 commercial ships and disabled 2 others that didn't comply with the blockade. For more, let's bring in Nega Anga. She is a visiting fellow at King's College London and former senior advisor at the U.S. State Department and National Security Council under the Biden administration. Nega, thank you so much for your time. Let's start with the Houthis ramping up aggression. And you heard the translation of the spokesperson there, threatening a blockade of another waterway. What do you make of this escalation for escalation declaration?
Right. Well, hello. Thanks for having me. Look, I think where we are right now, the paradox is that the central front between the U.S. And the Iranians in the Strait of Hormuz is sort of cooling right now, but the conflict is spreading geographically. So when we think about this, the Houthis are essentially trying to do at Bab al-Mandab what the Iranians did in the Strait of Hormuz. So they're essentially turning this geography into some sort of political and economic leverage. And so they're threatening Saudi tankers, their energy infrastructures. They're also showing that any regional security arrangement needs to account for the Houthis as well. So they're essentially, in many ways aligned with Iran. They benefit from Iranian support, but they do have their own, leadership, their own domestic ambitions, their own appetite for risk. And so this is actually a very concerning sort of shift in where we are in the conflict in the Middle East, because again, there's only so much that the Iranians can also control Houthi action. And so this could escalate quite quickly.
Nega, let's turn to Iran itself. And we find ourselves on air without a bombing strike campaign carried out by the U.S. today on Iran. A pause after more than 2 weeks. We also now have, according to a U.S. official and a source familiar with the matter, reporting that Vice President J.D. Vance and General Dan Kane both raised to President Trump concerns about escalating the war, including concerns about the U.S. munitions stockpile. Now, we do want to be clear that it's unclear if the munitions concern was a deciding factor in operations being on hold. But is that too large of a leap to think it may have been?
It could be a possibility, but again, there's a lot of rhetoric that is being passed around. It could be in reaction to Congress's actions. It could be in reaction to, trying to deliver some sort of indirect messages to the Iranians or others. But, what I could essentially say right now, it looks like Washington is just trying to cool the temperature, trying to enforce some form of de-escalation. I think they truly are testing as well reciprocity. They want to see if the pause in these strikes also mean that Tehran will also exercise some form of restraint. So I don't know necessarily if how much weight we can put behind it. It is quite plausible. But at the same time, I think, again, everyone is trying to find these diplomatic off-ramps. And this could be one of those scenarios.
And you really highlighted there just how complicated this all is with so many different factors playing into it. I do know that this is not the first time that there's been concerns of munition stockpile being low for the United States military. Can you help us understand, for those without a military background, what that truly means and what does that look like? What are the potential implications outside of Iran if the stockpile's low?
That's a great question. Again, we have to keep in mind, the president of the United States, the Trump administration right now has to focus on the U.S.'s national security. So when we look at our national security, it's global. So the concerns are, if we are expending all of our resources in a region, what does that mean if for whatever reason, U.S., whether it's U.S. territories, U.S. friends and allies, are attacked in another part of the world? Again, there are so many different central commands globally around the world. Again, there are concerns that the United States needs to have enough resources and assets if something were to occur near and close to the homeland or in the Pacific, and they need to be prepared for all scenarios.
The occupied West Bank, where Israeli forces used tear gas and arrested dozens of Palestinians on Saturday. It happened in the village of Tel, where just a day earlier, Clashes left 4 Palestinians and 2 Israeli soldiers dead. On the orders of the prime minister, the Israeli military began preparing for a large-scale operation, canceling leave and getting ready to send in reinforcements. A paramedic described how people in the village are feeling.
People here are scared of what happened yesterday, noting that around 8 houses were set on fire in the village, and vehicles as well. So people started taking precautions and buying fire extinguishers and first aid kits to be able to tend to the incidents until the needed services and paramedics arrive.
But some Israelis are coming together to condemn settler assaults on Palestinians in the West Bank. Here's a look at Tel Aviv on Saturday, for example, filled with people chanting and carrying eye-catching signs. The deadly Friday incident in the West Bank, it came amid a marked escalation in settler attacks in the territory. The UN has called for urgent action to stop the violence. And now to concerns of the Iran war widening with a new front emerging in the Red Sea. Iranian-backed Houthis are claiming responsibility for a new wave of attacks against Saudi Arabia. And it comes a day after Saudi Arabia launched strikes in retaliation for Houthi attacks on commercial ships. CNN's Nick Robertson has more.
Yeah, the significance is it's another route for Saudi oil that's trying to get to the international markets down the Red Sea. About 5-7% of the energy needs, particularly of Asia, passes down the Red Sea, particularly now as the Strait of Hormuz is closed. So the fact that the Houthis have said they're putting a blockade on it for Saudi tankers with Saudi oil on board, and they've hit a couple, then the Saudis struck their port of Hudaydah last night. Then this morning, the Houthis upped the ante again, hitting not just ships in the Red Sea, but actually Saudi energy facilities on land. The port city of Jazan, the Houthis claimed that they targeted Aramco energy facilities there, and in Yanbu, further north, a key vital point in Saudi's oil distribution network, because that's the hub of where the pipeline that comes all the way across Saudi Arabia gets to export the oil on the Red Sea. Now, sirens did go off. The air defense system in Yanbu was put on alert, but no signs of impact there. But around Jazan, a lot of black smoke was seen coming up. So this is a dynamic where the Saudis really have made a lot of preparations already for the possibility of not just continued strikes against the Houthis, but the potential for ground forces, ground operations against the Houthis. That's all sort of up in the air at the moment, let's say. We don't know if it's going to escalate or how it's going to play out. Looking across at the Strait of Hormuz and the US-Iran dynamic, I think it's significant. There are a couple of things that have happened. The Omanis have sent a negotiating delegation to Tehran. They're not sort of official mediators in this at the moment, but they have been in the past. So they sent a delegation to Tehran. The Qataris have told their shipping that it'll be free to travel tomorrow out through wherever it wants to go, providing it normally takes proper safety protocols. This does seem to signal that there is some hope in the region at the moment, and certainly that's my understanding, that the diplomats who are close to the process, who are looking at what happens tonight, and if there is no exchange of fire between the US and Iran tonight, then they'll be feeling that this is some kind of unofficial, if you will, behind the scenes type ceasefire deal. So I think there's some hope in the region that if tonight is quiet, then perhaps we're entering a new phase or a new step in the current phase at least. But it really is very, very, very difficult to say which way it will go.
And now to the Middle East, where the war with Iran may be spreading beyond the Gulf. Video shows smoke rising near an oil facility along Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast, which the Houthis claimed to have hit on Saturday. The Iranian-backed rebel group in Yemen says it carried out 2 military operations using dozens of missiles and drones. This all comes a day after Saudi Arabia launched strikes in retaliation for Houthi attacks on commercial ships.
We reaffirm that the maritime blockade imposed on the Saudi enemy remains in force in response to its aggression and unjust blockade, which has continued for 12 years. we will not hesitate to expand our military movements and escalate our actions in the coming hours and days, in line with our policy of blockade for blockade and escalation for escalation.
The U.S. military is enforcing its blockade of Iranian ports. It says U.S. forces boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea on Saturday to verify it was in compliance before allowing it to continue its journey. Since reimposing the blockade earlier this month, the U.S. military has redirected 12 commercial ships and disabled 2 others that didn't comply with the blockade. Well, Nabi Bulus, Middle East Bureau Chief for the Los Angeles Times, joins me now from Amman to discuss more. It's good to see you, sir. Can you just start by setting the scene for us? What's the mood like where you are right now?
Well, Jordan is a particularly interesting case right now because although it's not as prominent as the other Gulf countries in terms of the sheer number of attacks by Iran, it nevertheless has received its share, especially in the last 13 days. So if you consider that we've had, near nightly bombings of Iran, Jordan has been attacked on at least 9 separate occasions. And the targets have been U.S. facilities within Jordanian bases across the country. So as you can imagine, this has been it's quite a ramp up for Jordan, which is normally, it's more quiet than other nations at this point. And so this has been an interesting time here. At the same time, the fact is the tension that you're feeling in the region is across the entire region at this point because of the sheer number of conflicts that are brewing all around. If you consider what's been happening in Yemen, if you consider what's been happening in Iran, of course, and of course in Jordan with the attacks and also in the West Bank, etc., and of course in Lebanon, it's been quite a trying time for leaders across the region.
As you mentioned, we did see U.S. service member deaths in Jordan just a few days ago. Tell me how significant that moment was within this conflict.
Well, it's worth noting that Jordan has been a loyal partner of the U.S. in terms of military and counterterrorism issues for decades now, right? If we're just considering the history of this, from Al-Qaeda to ISIS, etc., Jordan has really opened up its bases for Western troops to come in and conduct operations in the region. Now, at the same time, Jordan has sought to downplay that with its domestic population, because the fact is, with the U.S.'s support for Israel, etc., and of course Jordan's population being overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian, they've sought to downplay this. This has very much put it on the fore. The recent incidents have put this on the fore, and so Jordan's attitude right now is that it wants to continue keeping this on a low profile, and at the same time, it wants to also make sure that none of this happens again. Right? We are talking about, at this point, I believe 9 attacks on separate bases across the country, right, from the south to the north. And so Jordan is interested in not having this happen anymore. Now, whether it can do so is a separate matter, because at the same time, its role in the U.S.'s war on Iran is increasing. Just in the last few days, we've been seeing these air bridges just going back and forth between a number of bases in Jordan and from Europe and elsewhere. And this indicates a ramp up is coming in terms of combat operations.
Well, at the same time as that, the U.S. does appear to have paused fresh strikes while tightening maritime enforcement. Do you think that's a tactical pause or just a change in strategy?
It's worth noting that if we consider the MOU and what was been happening before, right, there has been talk that this was merely an attempt to replenish already depleted stockpiles of interceptors and ammunition and other logistical issues to be dealt with. So, I must say it does seem to be that, because there is no real impetus towards any kind of ceasefire. Or
head to the next 24 hours, what do you think is the biggest thing that you're going to be watching for?
Well, at this point, the main issue is happening in Bab el-Mandeb on the Red Sea. Right? The fact is that if the Houthis do manage to reimpose a blockade of their own in that area, right, we are talking about a massive spike in energy prices immediately. And logistically, that will be a big problem for various countries in the region that have been actually reorienting their energy supplies away from the Strait of Hormuz towards the Red Sea. If that changes, we are talking about a big problem across the region, because then you'll have countries like Jordan, Egypt, and others even more affected. And these countries do not have the same financial cushion, right, if you will, as the Gulf nations do. So we are looking at, I have to say, unfortunately, more trouble ahead.
Can you believe that so many months later, we're still talking about this?
Well, the fact is, this has been very much, I think, the policy of the administration since it took over. right? I mean, if you consider the various conflicts that it's been involved in here, right? None of these conflicts have been resolved in any meaningful way. I mean, yes, the administration talks about all these conflicts that they have stopped or resolved, but it's all on a low ebb. I mean, just look at Gaza, right? We've been talking about a ceasefire there for, a year at this point, roughly speaking. And I mean, the fact is there is no ceasefire. Consider Lebanon, same thing. We've had a ceasefire there. It is not a ceasefire. We are, unfortunately, I think, in a new normal with this administration, where ceasefires don't really mean anything, where peacetime and war bleed into each other. And at the same time, there is no real resolution of any conflict. And that perhaps is the policy.
I want to take you to the Middle East now, where the U.S. military campaign against Iran is on hold. Now, that's according to a source with the Defense Department. We are also learning that Vice President J.D. Vance and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have both raised concerns about escalating the war with Iran. Now, it is not clear that is why the U.S. paused strikes after nearly 2 weeks of daily attacks, but the U.S. military does continue to enforce its blockade of Iranian ports. It says U.S. forces boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea on Saturday to verify it was in compliance before allowing it to continue its journey. Now, meanwhile, a new front is emerging in the Red Sea. Video shows smoke rising near an oil facility along Saudi Arabia's coast, which the Houthis claimed to have hit on Saturday. The Iranian-backed rebel group in Yemen says it carried out 2 military operations using dozens of missiles and drones. For more on all of this, I'm joined by Nick Robertson, live in Jerusalem. This is very interesting to me, Nick, this idea that both the vice president and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff raised concerns about escalating the war any further with Iran. Do you know what those concerns are? And could they possibly explain this pause in airstrikes?
Yeah, analysts that CNN's been talking to talk about a diminution in the capability of air defenses, defending from incoming ballistic missiles, that in the early part of the war, the US spent more than half its inventory. This is an analysis, not figures coming from the Pentagon, but more than half of its THAAD, the high altitude interceptor missile, that it's spent close to half of its Patriot defensive missiles, and these can't be quickly replaced. They are being replaced. Production continues, but they're not immediately available. The Tomahawk, the cruise missile attack, about 30% of those used. So the analysis is that if you continue to double down and fire missiles at Iran, Iran sends their missiles back, they need to be intercepted. Then if you need to fight another war, wherever that may be, you're going to find yourself depleted. That's the sort of assessment. And we don't know exactly the words that Dan Kane used when briefing President Trump. But we do know that this is a broad concern within the industry. I think to get a better understanding of why we're seeing a pause at the moment, that some diplomats I'm talking to are sort of giving this as akin to an unannounced ceasefire. It seems to be to give breathing space for the talks that the Omani delegation had in Tehran on Friday and Saturday. And we've heard from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson on that, saying that there was progress, that there will continue to be technical and political level talks about that. And the talks were focused on the Strait of Hormuz. So I think the understanding perhaps here is that there is a pause being given at the moment to allow talks to unravel both sides' positions on the Strait of Hormuz. We don't know if Iran continues to hold by its original position that it absolutely must be able to control the Strait and therefore make money out of it in the future. There's no reason to see that that has changed. And both sides very publicly, as you say, showing that their blockades are in place. The Iranian state media today saying that 6 ships have been forced to be put at anchor and not to try to transit the Strait. And I think, if you look at the imaging and messaging from both sides, they're emphasizing not the kinetic side that we've seen both Iranians and the US use to stop ships in their tracks, to hit them militarily. But they're using the sort of inspection tactic. The ship's going to anchor is the message coming from the Iranians. And again, that speaks to a sort of a just tamping down the escalating rhetoric and escalating positions. So while the concerns exist over weapons, it does seem also that perhaps part of the reason that there's that concern exists, and therefore you need to talk, the space has been created for those talks.
Nick Robertson on what might be breathing space for diplomacy. Thank you so much. The U.S. military has officially confirmed the identity of a soldier killed during Iranian strikes in Jordan on July 17th. The Pentagon says she is Staff Sergeant Angel Rampersad, a 28-year-old from Ozen Park, New York. The Defense Department says she was known to her family as Sarah, was born in Trinidad and came to the U.S. as a toddler and was raised by a single mother. Where the U.S. military campaign against Iran is on hold. That's according to a source with the Defense Department. We're also learning that Vice President J.D. Vance and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have both raised concerns about escalating the war. Now, it's not clear if that is why the U.S. paused strikes after nearly 2 weeks of daily attacks. The U.S. military is, however, enforcing its blockade of Iranian ports. It says U.S. forces boarded a tanker in the Arabian Sea Saturday to verify it was in compliance before allowing it to continue its journey. Meanwhile, a front is emerging in the Red Sea. Video shows smoke rising near an oil facility along Saudi Arabia's coast, which the Houthis claim to have hit on Saturday. The Iranian-backed rebel group in Yemen says it carried out 2 military operations using dozens of missiles and drones. We're joined now live by Nick Robertson. He is in Jerusalem. So we now have this 2-day pause in airstrikes, Nick. Do we have any indication of what that means? Because we have these contradicting messages from Washington. At times we're hearing that President Trump is weighing a massive attack, but also we're hearing today, of course, that the Vice President and the Joint Chiefs of Staff are warning against an escalation. Do you have any insight? Have you been speaking to your sources on this?
I think the best insight we have that there is, in fact, a sort of a de facto ceasefire in place, and that does seem to have been allow some level of diplomacy to happen. The Omanis had a delegation in Tehran on Friday and Saturday. They left late Saturday. We don't know what was precisely discussed, but it does seem to have focused on the Straits of Hormuz. At least that's according to the spokesman at the Foreign Ministry in Tehran. And he said that the talks were constructive and there was progress, but progress that the United States would like to see on the Strait of Hormuz would attract a management system and financial benefit for controlling the Strait of Hormuz. That's the conundrum here. So while there's been this pause, which may be beneficial to the U.S. to pause before it makes the next move, because there are concerns. Joint Chiefs of Staff Dan Kane laying that out to the president. We don't know precisely what was said again on that, but there's concern about munitions going forward. And from independent experts, we understand that is the defensive missile systems, the THAAD, the Patriot. They're in not short supply, but half of them have already been used. Stocks have been used in the first part of the war. So that